I took a solo camping trip in the summer of 2021, about mid-July. I was 34 at the time, living in eastern Idaho, and working from home most days, which gave me some flexibility. I'd been dealing with a heavy work schedule and personal stress, so I wanted a break. No phone, no traffic, no people. Just the woods, some gear, and a couple of quiet days away from everything. I had camped plenty of times before, mostly with friends, but I'd done a handful of solo trips too. I felt comfortable enough being out there on my own. I picked a place up in the Caribou-Targhee National Forest, about 2 hours from Idaho Falls. Not a big public campground, just a dispersed spot a bit off a rough Forest Service road. I'd found it a year earlier on a hiking trip and had marked it in my GPS. It was remote, surrounded by thick pine forest, and had a small, clear creek nearby. I left on a Friday morning around 10 a.m. My SUV was packed with supplies, tent, sleeping bag, cooler, a small camp stove, some freeze-dried meals, water, and a few extras like a hatchet and folding saw. I brought bear spray, a knife, and a flare gun just to be safe. The drive was quiet. I stopped for gas and filled up the tank before heading into the forest. Once I got off the main highway and onto the gravel roads, I didn't see another car for nearly an hour. The road got narrower and rougher the farther I drove. At one point, I had to slow to a crawl to avoid a fallen log, but I made it to the spot I had in mind. It was a small clearing just off the road, surrounded by tall trees on 3 sides with the creek maybe 60 feet away. No signs of anyone else being there recently, no tire tracks, no trash, no footprints. It was perfect. I set up my tent first, a 2-person dome tent I'd used a dozen times before. I staked it down firmly, double-checked the seams, and spread out my sleeping bag and mat inside. I set up the rest of camp slowly, built a fire ring from old stones, gathered some kindling, and stacked firewood I'd brought from home. Around 4 p.m., I cooked my first meal, just boiled water for some instant rice and beans. I ate while sitting on a log, the creek gurgling softly in the background. The air was warm and dry. The only sounds were birds and the occasional rustle in the brush. I felt relaxed for the first time in weeks. That first night was uneventful. I didn't light a fire since it was still warm, and I didn't want to attract animals. I read a paperback book by headlamp for a while, then turned in around 10 p.m. I kept my bear spray and knife within reach and zipped the tent tight. I fell asleep easily. I woke once during the night to pee and stepped outside. The woods were pitch black, but I could see stars through the trees. Nothing felt off. No weird sounds. Just wind and insects. I slept again till morning. The next day, Saturday, I spent most of the time exploring the area. I followed the creek upstream, climbed a small hill to get a better view, and took some photos. I made a small fire in the afternoon and cooked lunch over it. Some sausages I'd kept on ice and wrapped in foil. I made sure the fire was out when I was done. I sat by the creek afterward, letting my feet soak in the cold water. Still hadn't seen or heard a single person since I arrived. That night, things changed. I cooked dinner again, more freeze-dried food, and cleaned up carefully. No trash left out, no food in the tent. I kept everything stored in a sealed bin in the car, which was parked maybe 30 feet from the tent. I did hear something strange around 8 p.m. A low snapping sound from deeper in the woods, maybe 60 or 70 yards out. Not a branch falling, more like something stepping on dry sticks. I stood still and listened for a minute. Then nothing. I chalked it up to a deer or elk. They're common around there. I stayed close to camp after that, didn't wander. I went to bed a bit later than usual, around 11 p.m. I left the rain fly off the tent since the weather was dry and I liked the airflow. I remember lying in the dark, listening to the wind move through the trees. I was just about to drift off when I heard it again. Snapping twigs, not far off this time, maybe 30 yards and moving, not fast but steady. Something was walking in the dark. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound paused for a few seconds, then moved again, circling slightly, like whatever it was moving around my camp. I grabbed the bear spray and knife and sat up, completely still. I didn't turn on my light. I didn't want to give away my exact position. Then silence. Nothing for nearly 5 minutes. I stayed frozen, still holding the spray. Finally, I heard movement again, this time farther away. Kept moving until it was out of earshot. I waited at least 30 more minutes before I let myself lie down again. I didn't sleep well after that. Every little sound put me on edge. I woke up early the next morning, tired and uneasy. It was still dark, probably 5:30 a.m. The air felt colder, and a layer of dew covered everything. I stepped out of the tent, stretched, and walked around the camp. I noticed something immediately. The driver's side door of my SUV was cracked open. Not fully, just barely unlatched. I never leave it like that. I checked the inside. Nothing missing, but the bin with the food had been moved. It wasn't open, but it had been shifted from where I'd placed it. I know for a fact I'd shut and locked the doors. I double-checked every time, especially in bear country. There were no claw marks or scratches, no signs of a bear trying to get in, and no prints on the dusty ground around the car. But the door being open was enough to unsettle me. I decided not to stick around for another night. I still had food and supplies for a third day, but something didn't feel right. I packed up slowly, watching the tree lean often. I didn't hear or see anything unusual that morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept the bear spray on me the whole time. As I took down the tent, I found a single footprint in the dirt near the back. It wasn't mine. Too big. I wear size 10 boots. This looked like a 12 or 13, and it was deep. Clear tread pattern from a heavy hiking boot. It hadn't been there the day before. The print faced toward the tent and wasn't part of a trail or group of prints. Just one, like someone stood there for a while. That was the moment my stomach dropped. I loaded the last of my gear and got in the car. I didn't waste time. I drove back down the dirt road, slower than I wanted to avoid blowing a tire. I kept checking the mirrors. Still no sign of anyone. I hit the main road about 40 minutes later and finally felt a bit of relief. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near Rexburg. I filled up, used the restroom, and sat in the car with the engine running. I checked the car again just to be sure, nothing stolen, nothing broken. But I still couldn't explain the open door, the moved bin, or the footprint. When I got home, I checked the SUV again, going over every inch. I didn't see any damage. I pulled the SD card from the dashcam. It records while the car is on but shuts off when the ignition is off. There was nothing recorded from the time I was out there. No evidence of anyone. I didn't report anything to the police. It felt pointless. No crime had happened, and I had no solid proof. But I knew 100% someone had been near my tent that night, maybe more than once. Over the next few weeks, I kept thinking about it, replaying the sounds in the dark. That slow movement, the lone footprint. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. A hunter? A squatter? Just some stranger messing around? I'll never know. But I haven't camped alone since. I still go out, still hike, still sleep in tents, but only with other people now. I still think solo camping is a beautiful thing, but that experience taught me that being alone in the woods means you're also vulnerable. And sometimes it's not animals you have to worry about. It's people, quiet ones, the kind that move through the trees at night without making a sound, the kind that watch your camp while you sleep, the kind that leave no trace except for one deep footprint in the dirt. That single footprint is what stuck with me. I know it sounds like a small thing, but when you're out there alone, knowing for sure someone stood just outside your tent while you slept, it's something you don't forget. I don't need to know why they were there. I just know they were, and that's enough. I was 34 when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. It was the fall of 2019, late October, just as the leaves were turning to those dark reds and burnt oranges that make the forest look like it's on fire. I lived in Roanoke, worked in construction, and had been feeling burned out for months. The days were long, the work was hard, and I was tired of hearing machinery and people every day. So I figured I'd go off-grid for a weekend, maybe longer if it went well. I picked a spot using some topographic maps and GPS. It was about a 4-hour hike from the closest dirt Forest Service road. No trailheads nearby, no campgrounds, just deep woods. I packed my bag with the basics. A 2-person tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, water filter, first aid kit, multi-tool, small hatchet, a couple of lighters, and an old .38 revolver my uncle gave me when I turned 30. I never used it, never wanted to, but it came along on trips like this just in case. I also had my phone mostly turned off to save battery. The hike in was peaceful, quiet. I didn't see another person the whole time. No footprints, no signs of other campers. Just the steady rustle of my boots on the leaves and the distant sound of birds. The air was cool but not cold. Maybe low 60s during the day and dipping into the 40s at night. I found a spot on the eastern slope of a ridge, maybe 50 yards above a narrow stream, with a flat patch of ground surrounded by trees that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in years. I set up my tent and collected some wood from around the area, made a fire ring out of stones, and started a small fire just before the sun dropped below the horizon. That first night was calm. I ate some dehydrated chili, watched the fire flicker, and listened to the forest. The sound of owls, the occasional rustling of small animals in the leaves, maybe a raccoon or a fox. I slept early, tired from the hike. The next morning, I made instant coffee and oatmeal, then took a slow walk around the area. I didn't go far, just scouted maybe a few hundred yards in each direction. I was looking for anything interesting. Mushrooms, animal tracks, maybe even a good spot to sit and read for a while. I didn't find much except a narrow deer trail that led down to the creek. There were a few droppings on the trail and some broken brush that told me deer used it recently. That was normal. But on my way back to camp, I saw something strange. It was a tree maybe 30 feet from my tent. Nothing unusual about the tree itself, just an old maple, probably 50 or 60 years old. But near the base of the trunk, just above eye level, there were 3 shallow horizontal cuts in the bark. They weren't natural and they weren't made by an animal. They were clean, straight, and about 5 inches apart. I hadn't noticed them the day before, but I figured maybe I just missed it. Still, it gave me a weird feeling in my stomach. I touched the marks. They weren't fresh, no sap coming out, bark was dry around them. But they didn't look more than a few weeks old either. Back at camp, I tried to brush it off. People mark trees all the time, maybe hunters or surveyors. It wasn't like it was right next to the tent. Still, that part of the forest was supposed to be unvisited. No trails, no development. It didn't add up. That afternoon, I sat by the creek for hours. The water was ice cold, running shallow and clear. I skipped rocks, watched leaves float by. When I went back to camp near sunset, everything was where I left it. Nothing disturbed. I cooked a small meal, drank some filtered water, and sat by the fire again. That second night, I heard something. It was after midnight. I'd been asleep, but some kind of noise woke me. Not loud, but distinct. It sounded like something heavy stepping on dry leaves. Not just once, but slowly, spaced out, maybe every few seconds. Like a person walking, but not in any kind of hurry. My heart started pounding, and I held my breath, trying to listen. I lay still in my sleeping bag and reached slowly for the revolver near my pack. I stayed that way for at least 10 minutes, maybe more, just listening. The sound came and went. It didn't get closer, but it didn't leave either. Eventually, it faded off and I forced myself to sleep again, though not very well. When I got up in the morning, I stepped out of the tent and checked around the camp. Nothing seemed disturbed. I walked to the edge of the trees in the direction where I thought I heard the noise. After a few minutes of scanning the forest floor, I found something that made my skin go cold. There was a boot print in the leaves. Not deep, but clear. About a size 10, maybe 11. Not mine. The tread was different. I was wearing old hiking boots with a zigzag pattern. This was more like a work boot, straight ridges. I stood there staring at it for a while, then walked in a wide circle, looking for more prints. I found 2 more, spaced out like someone had been walking slowly. Same direction I heard the sounds the night before. I packed up my stuff fast that morning, threw everything back into my backpack in half the time it usually takes me. I wasn't panicking, but I wasn't going to wait around and see who had been out there. My plan was to hike halfway back to the road and camp closer to where I had parked, maybe even sleep in the truck if I had to. As I was zipping up the tent bag, I heard something again. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was a sharp, metallic sound, faint, but it carried through the trees. It sounded like something hitting metal. I froze and listened. It didn't come again. I started hiking fast. I stayed on the same path I came in on, checked behind me every few minutes. My chest felt tight the whole time. I didn't stop to eat, didn't stop for water. I just wanted to get to the lower ridge, set up somewhere safe and wait until morning to make the rest of the trip back. It was late afternoon by the time I stopped. I found a spot close to a rock outcropping that would give me some cover. I didn't make a fire that night. I didn't unpack anything except the essentials. Just laid out the tent, pulled the sleeping bag over me with the revolver tucked inside it. I barely slept. Early the next morning, I started the final hike back to the road. I'd gone maybe a mile when I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. A broken branch on the side of the trail. Not just broken, but snapped clean and hanging at an unnatural angle. Right beside it, there was a black zip tie looped around a small sapling. Just one. No other markings. I hadn't seen that when I came in. Then, about 50 feet farther down the trail, I found another one. Same thing. A zip tie around a young tree. Someone had been there recently, marking the trail maybe. I looked around in every direction and didn't see or hear anything, but my gut told me I was being watched. I picked up my pace and didn't stop until I reached the forest road. I practically jogged the last half mile to where my truck was parked on a small pull-off. The tires were fine, no damage. I checked underneath in the bed. Everything looked untouched. As I was putting my pack in the truck, I looked down and noticed something wedged under one of the tires. A folded piece of paper. It had been placed so that the tire would pin it down but not rip it. I pulled it out and opened it slowly. It was a piece of yellow legal pad paper. There were 5 words written on it in shaky handwriting. "You shouldn't be out here." No name, no other notes. I stood there holding it for a long time, not sure what to do. My hands were shaking. I got in the truck, locked the doors, and started driving. I didn't stop until I hit cell service again. I thought about calling someone, the sheriff, maybe, but what would I say? That I found boot prints, zip ties, and a weird note? I kept the note. Still have it folded up in a drawer back home. I never went back to that part of the woods again. I stopped camping alone after that trip. Still go out sometimes, but only with friends, and never that deep into unknown territory. I've told a few people the story over the years, but I always leave out the details. They'd probably just say it was a hunter or someone messing around, but it wasn't a joke. The way those steps came and went in the middle of the night, the markings on the trees, the zip ties, the paper, it was all intentional. Someone had been watching, someone who didn't want me there. I think about it every time I pack a bag for the outdoors, and I always double-check now, not just my gear, but where I'm going, who might be out there, and if I ever see another zip tie on a tree in the middle of the woods, I won't stop. I'll turn around and leave, and I won't look back. I had planned the trip for months. It was the summer of 2012, and I was 24 years old. After spending long hours working in the city, I craved the quiet and rawness of nature, so I decided to go camping alone in the northern forests of Vermont. I wasn't new to camping, but this time I wanted to go deeper into the woods than usual, to a small state park known for its dense trees and remote trails. I packed my gear carefully. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cool weather, a small stove, plenty of canned food, a first aid kit, a reliable flashlight, extra batteries, and my trusty pocket knife. I also brought a map and compass, something I thought would keep me safe. My phone barely had signal out there, but I made sure to tell my sister where I was going and when I planned to return. The drive up was long but peaceful. The roads wound through green hills, and the sun was shining bright but not too hot. When I reached the park entrance, the rangers gave me a quick briefing and a map. The place was mostly empty, which was exactly what I wanted. No crowds, just the woods. I carried my pack about 3 miles from the parking lot to the site I'd picked. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pine and maple trees, with a narrow stream trickling nearby. The ground was soft with fallen needles and a thin layer of leaves. I liked the quiet here. It felt untouched. I set up my tent carefully, checking each stake and line twice. I wanted everything secure because the forecast said it might rain the next day. Once my camp was ready, I collected some dry wood and made a small fire pit using stones. I knew the rules: no big fires and always fully extinguish them. I started a fire just before sunset and heated some canned beans and rice for dinner. I ate slowly, enjoying the silence and the smell of pine. After eating, I sat by the fire with a small notebook, jotting down thoughts. I always liked to keep a journal on trips like this. The crackling fire was comforting, and the woods began to darken. Stars started to peek out through gaps in the branches. As night fully settled, I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped the tent tightly, and laid my flashlight close by. I felt safe, or so I thought. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I wasn't sure what it was: a rustling, a soft crunching sound coming from just outside the tent. I froze and listened carefully. The woods were supposed to be quiet except for the occasional night bird or insect, but this noise was different. It was heavier, more deliberate, like something moving carefully but with purpose. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make a sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, shining on the trees and underbrush, but I couldn't see anything clearly. The noise stopped the moment I shined the light toward it. I stayed still for a long minute, then slowly zipped up the tent again. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon scavenging for food. Maybe a bear, but that thought made me uneasy. I packed bear spray but never had to use it before. I lay back down but couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me tense. The wind moved the branches above, leaves whispered, and every crack of a twig sounded like footsteps. I kept the flashlight in my hand, ready to turn it on again if I heard something. At around 3 a.m., the noise returned, this time closer, more distinct. It wasn't the usual animal sounds I knew. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing around my tent. Something was out there. I didn't see it, but I could feel it. The ground trembled faintly with each step. I thought about calling for help, but I had no phone signal. No one would hear me. The footsteps circled my tent for nearly an hour. I kept silent, hoping whatever it was would leave. But then I heard the crunch of gravel and the soft, dragging sound of a heavy object being moved near the edge of the clearing. My mind raced. Was it a person? Why would someone be here in the middle of the night? My thoughts went to every survival story I had ever read, every warning about strangers in the woods. I remembered the bear spray and quietly reached for it, heart hammering. The tent fabric shook slightly, as if touched by something. I pulled the tent flap back just enough to shine the flashlight out into the dark. Nothing. I held my breath and listened. The sounds stopped suddenly. Silence returned. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. I cautiously unzipped the tent and looked around. Near the fire pit, there were footprints, large, heavy, and human. I followed them into the woods and saw marks on some tree trunks. Deep scratches, maybe made with a knife or another sharp object. Fear gripped me. This wasn't just a random hiker or camper. Someone had been near my tent all night, watching or waiting. I packed up quickly, deciding not to stay another night. I kept my eyes sharp on the trail back, constantly scanning the woods. Twice I thought I saw movement in the distance, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I reached the parking lot mid-morning and found the ranger station. I told them what happened, showing the footprints and tree scratches. They said it was rare but not unheard of. Sometimes people came to the park for more than just camping. They advised me to file a report, and a ranger came with me to inspect the area. The ranger explained there had been some reports over the years of people living illegally in the woods, some of whom could be dangerous. They sometimes stayed hidden and occasionally approached campers to steal supplies or avoid being caught. I realized how lucky I was that nothing worse happened. I was just an unlucky witness to something many campers never encounter. After filing the report, I drove home, shaken but grateful. The woods were still beautiful, but they were also wild and unpredictable. I knew I'd be more careful next time. Camping solo was never going to be the same. The trip taught me a harsh lesson about safety and trust in the outdoors. Nature could be calm, but it could also hide dangers beyond animals or weather. The real risk sometimes came from people. I had planned the trip for months. It was the summer of 2012, and I was 24 years old. After spending long hours working in the city, I craved the quiet and rawness of nature, so I decided to go camping alone in the northern forests of Vermont. I wasn't new to camping, but this time I wanted to go deeper into the woods than usual, to a small state park known for its dense trees and remote trails. I packed my gear carefully: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cool weather, a small stove, plenty of canned food, a first aid kit, a reliable flashlight, extra batteries, and my trusty pocket knife. I also brought a map and compass, something I thought would keep me safe. My phone barely had signal out there, but I made sure to tell my sister where I was going and when I planned to return. The drive up was long but peaceful. The roads wound through green hills, and the sun was shining bright but not too hot. When I reached the park entrance, the rangers gave me a quick briefing and a map. The place was mostly empty, which was exactly what I wanted. No crowds, just the woods. I carried my pack about 3 miles from the parking lot to the site I'd picked. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pine and maple trees, with a narrow stream trickling nearby. The ground was soft with fallen needles and a thin layer of leaves. I liked the quiet here. It felt untouched. I set up my tent carefully, checking each stake and line twice. I wanted everything secure because the forecast said it might rain the next day. Once my camp was ready, I collected some dry wood and made a small fire pit using stones. I knew the rules: no big fires, and always fully extinguish them. I started a fire just before sunset and heated some canned beans and rice for dinner. I ate slowly, enjoying the silence and the smell of pine. After eating, I sat by the fire with a small notebook, jotting down thoughts. I always liked to keep a journal on trips like this. The crackling fire was comforting, and the woods began to darken. Stars started to peek out through gaps in the branches. As night fully settled, I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped the tent tightly, and laid my flashlight close by. I felt safe, or so I thought. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I wasn't sure what it was: a rustling, a soft crunching sound coming from just outside the tent. I froze and listened carefully. The woods were supposed to be quiet except for the occasional night bird or insect, but this noise was different. It was heavier, more deliberate, like something moving carefully but with purpose. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make a sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, shining on the trees and underbrush, but I couldn't see anything clearly. The noise stopped the moment I shined the light toward it. I stayed still for a long minute, then slowly zipped up the tent again. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon scavenging for food. Maybe a bear, but that thought made me uneasy. I packed bear spray but never had to use it before. I lay back down but couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me tense. The wind moved the branches above, leaves whispered, and every crack of a twig sounded like footsteps. I kept the flashlight in my hand, ready to turn it on again if I heard something. At around 3 a.m., the noise returned, this time closer, more distinct. It wasn't the usual animal sounds I knew. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing around my tent. Something was out there. I didn't see it, but I could feel it. The ground trembled faintly with each step. I thought about calling for help, but I had no phone signal. No one would hear me. The footsteps circled my tent for nearly an hour. I kept silent, hoping whatever it was would leave. But then I heard the crunch of gravel and the soft, dragging sound of a heavy object being moved near the edge of the clearing. My mind raced. Was it a person? Why would someone be here in the middle of the night? My thoughts went to every survival story I had ever read, every warning about strangers in the woods. I remembered the bear spray and quietly reached for it, heart hammering. The tent fabric shook slightly, as if touched by something. I pulled the tent flap back just enough to shine the flashlight out into the dark. Nothing. I held my breath and listened. The sounds stopped suddenly. Silence returned. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. I cautiously unzipped the tent and looked around. Near the fire pit, there were footprints, large, heavy, and human. I followed them into the woods and saw marks on some tree trunks. Deep scratches, maybe made with a knife or another sharp object. Fear gripped me. This wasn't just a random hiker or camper. Someone had been near my tent all night, watching or waiting. I packed up quickly, deciding not to stay another night. I kept my eyes sharp on the trail back, constantly scanning the woods. Twice I thought I saw movement in the distance, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I reached the parking lot mid-morning and found the ranger station. I told them what happened, showing the footprints and tree scratches. They said it was rare but not unheard of. Sometimes people came to the park for more than just camping. They advised me to file a report, and a ranger came with me to inspect the area. The ranger explained there had been some reports over the years of people living illegally in the woods, some of whom could be dangerous. They sometimes stayed hidden and occasionally approached campers to steal supplies or avoid being caught. I realized how lucky I was that nothing worse happened. I was just an unlucky witness to something many campers never encounter. After filing the report, I drove home, shaken but grateful. The woods were still beautiful, but they were also wild and unpredictable. I knew I'd be more careful next time. Camping solo was never going to be the same. The trip taught me a harsh lesson about safety and trust in the outdoors. Nature could be calm, but it could also hide dangers beyond animals or weather. The real risk sometimes came from people. It was the summer of 2019, late July, when I decided to take a solo trip into the mountains of northern Vermont. I had spent the better part of the last year locked inside an apartment in Boston, working a demanding office job that left me drained. I needed a break, a chance to clear my mind and spend time in the wilderness, far from city noise and the constant hum of people and deadlines. I picked a small, relatively unknown state park called Green Pine Preserve. It wasn't crowded, had dense forests, a couple of small lakes, and plenty of trails. I'd hiked and camped before, but never alone. It was something I wanted to try, to push myself a little, see if I could handle being out there without anyone else around. I packed my backpack carefully with all the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, a stove, food, water filter, a flashlight, map, compass, and a small first aid kit. I left my phone behind, except for a battery pack, knowing that reception would be spotty at best. The drive up was about 4 hours from Boston. I arrived near dusk and parked at the trailhead. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. I slung on my pack and started hiking in, following a narrow, uneven path that wound through thick brush and towering trees. The sounds of the city faded quickly, replaced by the rustling of leaves and occasional bird calls. After about 3 miles, I reached a small clearing near a quiet lake, the kind of place that felt untouched and peaceful. The sun was dipping low behind the hills, and the sky turned a soft orange. I picked a flat spot and set up my tent carefully, hammering stakes into the soft soil. I built a small fire ring with stones I found nearby, careful to clear away dry leaves and twigs. I gathered some wood, enough for a fire later. I cooked a simple meal of instant noodles and canned beans on my tiny stove, the steam rising in the cool evening air. The lake was calm, its surface smooth like glass, reflecting the fading light. As night fell, the forest around me grew darker, the shapes of trees stretching and merging into a wall of shadow. The stars came out bright and clear overhead, and for a moment, I felt a deep calm. I climbed into my sleeping bag and lay in the tent, listening to the night sounds. The hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the lake. It was quiet, but not empty. It felt alive in a way that was different from the city. It was peaceful, yet there was something primal about the darkness pressing in around me. I fell asleep with the sound of the lake lapping gently at the shore. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought it was the cold or a dream, but then I heard it. The the sound of footsteps outside the tent. Slow, heavy steps, crunching on dry leaves and twigs, coming from the edge of the clearing. My heart started pounding. I lay still, trying to listen, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, moving slowly in a circle around my tent. I didn't make a sound. I didn't move. My mind raced. I had brought pepper spray, but it was in my pack outside the tent, and reaching for it felt impossible. The footsteps were heavy, slow, deliberate. Whoever or whatever it was, they were close. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded away toward the woods. I waited a long time before moving. When I finally dared to unzip the tent and peek out, the clearing was empty except for the fire ring and scattered leaves. My heart was still hammering. I stared into the dark forest, trying to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but the steps had sounded too heavy for a deer, and I had read enough about bears to know they usually avoid humans unless provoked. Still, the idea of a person out here at night walking around my campsite unsettled me deeply. I tried to calm down and went back to sleep, though the rest of the night passed in a haze of half-wakefulness. When dawn came, I emerged from the tent cautiously. I checked the area, looking for footprints or anything else, but there was nothing clear. The soil was too soft and disturbed to give good prints. I spent the day hiking the trails, keeping my eyes peeled for any signs of other people. I avoided areas that looked heavily trafficked and stuck to less obvious paths. The woods felt less welcoming now, the stillness sometimes broken by distant sounds, branches snapping, rustling bushes. Every shadow seemed to flicker. That evening, I returned to the same clearing. The sun was low, and I made sure to set up my tent quickly and keep a fire going. I ate my dinner quietly and watched the lake shimmer in the fading light. As night fell again, I felt a deep unease. I kept a small pocket knife close and double-checked that my phone was charged and within reach. I listened carefully to every sound. Then, a low howl echoed through the trees. A wild animal, I thought, probably a coyote. The howl was eerie but natural. Still, I felt eyes on me, even though I saw nothing. Suddenly, the footsteps returned. They were closer this time, circling the clearing again, slow and heavy. But this time, I heard something else. A faint, metallic clinking, like keys or tools jangling softly. I felt a cold spike of fear. Someone was out here, and they weren't just wandering, they were watching. I sat perfectly still in my tent, heart racing. The footsteps stopped near my tent flap, and for a long moment, nothing moved. Then the sound of something being dropped, a small rock or maybe a piece of metal, hit the ground just outside. The footsteps walked away, fading into the woods. I lay awake the rest of the night, unable to sleep, listening for any sound. In the morning, I was too anxious to stay. I packed quickly, folding up the tent and stuffing it into my pack. I noticed faint footprints in the damp earth just outside my tent. Heavy boots, worn down, larger than mine. They weren't recent but fresh enough to tell someone had been there during the night. I hiked back toward the trailhead as fast as I could, never looking back. When I got to my car, I locked the doors and sat inside for a long time, heart still pounding, eyes scanning the trees. The sun was shining bright, but I felt shaken, as if the quiet woods were hiding something dark just beyond the trees. I drove away without a second thought. I never returned to that park or any remote solo camping trip for that matter. The idea of being watched, stalked in silence, was enough to keep me away from those woods forever. I told no one about what happened. People wouldn't believe me. They'd say I was imagining things or that it was just animals. But I know what I heard and what I felt in those nights alone. The wilderness isn't always safe, even when it seems quiet and calm. Sometimes there are people out there watching, waiting, and you don't know if they'll show themselves or what they want. That trip changed how I see nature and how I see solitude. Being alone is a gift, but it can also be a danger. And sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see. It was early October in 2019 when I decided to take a break from everything and go camping in the forests near Mount Hood, Oregon. I was 26, worked long hours in the city as a graphic designer, and needed some space to breathe. The plan was simple: drive out, find a quiet spot in the woods, set up camp, and spend 3 days alone, away from the noise and people. I had done solo camping before, but never for this long, and never in a place this remote. The morning I left was crisp and clear. The sky was bright blue with no clouds. I packed my car with the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small stove, matches, a map, and a compass. I made sure my phone was fully charged, but knew there'd be no signal once I got deep into the forest. That was part of the appeal: no distractions, no interruptions. The drive to the trailhead took about 2 hours from Portland. I could see the mountain towering ahead, its peak dusted lightly with snow. The trees along the way were tall Douglas firs and western red cedars, with the leaves of the maples turning orange and red. It was the perfect time of year to be in the forest, cool, dry, with the smell of pine needles and earth. I parked at a small clearing near a trailhead marked on my map. There were a few cars there, mostly people planning day hikes. I loaded my pack and started walking on the dirt path leading away from the road. The trail was narrow, winding, covered with fallen leaves and pine cones. After about an hour, I reached a fork in the trail. One path led up a hill, the other followed the creek. I chose the path by the creek, wanting to camp near water. I walked deeper into the forest. The sounds of the city faded completely. Instead, there was only the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze, birds chirping somewhere high above, and the occasional splash of water from the creek. I felt lighter, as if all my stress was dissolving with every step. After another hour, I found a small flat clearing beside the creek, shielded by tall trees. It was quiet, peaceful, perfect. I set up my tent carefully between 2 sturdy trees, making sure it was stable. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. I gathered some dry wood nearby and arranged a small fire pit with stones around it. The sun was still high, but I knew it would be cold at night. I built a fire and warmed a simple meal: canned chili with some crackers and a thermos of hot tea. The warmth from the fire and the smell of burning wood felt comforting. I watched the smoke curl up into the sky as the sun started lowering behind the trees. The forest changed color. Shadows grew long and dark. As darkness fell, I crawled into my sleeping bag in the tent. The night air was cool, and the creek's murmur was steady, almost hypnotic. The stars came out, bright and clear. I felt safe and calm, ready for a good night's sleep. But around midnight, something woke me. It was a soft, crunching noise outside the tent, like footsteps on dry leaves and twigs. I froze, listening. The forest was silent except for that sound, slow and deliberate, moving closer. My heart started beating faster, but I told myself it was probably a deer or some animal passing by. The noise stopped near my tent. I held my breath, eyes wide in the dark. Then I heard a faint sniffing sound, like an animal smelling the air. My mind raced. Bears were known to roam these woods, especially near water sources. I remembered the bear spray in my pack, but it was buried deep inside. The footsteps moved away slowly, crunching again over twigs and leaves. I stayed still until the sounds disappeared completely. When I finally relaxed, I realized I couldn't sleep anymore. The woods were alive in a way I'd never felt before, quiet but tense. The next morning, I packed up the fire pit and hiked a little further upstream, hoping to find a spot less likely to attract wildlife. The creek was clear and cold, with rocks that glistened in the morning light. I filtered some water and ate a dry breakfast of granola bars and nuts. The forest seemed peaceful again in daylight. As the day went on, I explored small side trails, taking photographs of the colorful leaves and moss-covered trunks. I felt good being alone, away from everything. But a strange feeling nagged at me. I wasn't as alone as I thought. Around midday, I noticed something odd on the ground. Footprints. Not animal tracks, but human. They were fresh, muddy, and headed in the same direction as me, toward the deeper forest. I scanned the trees, but saw no one. I slowed down and tried to be quiet. The forest had shifted. The birds were silent. The wind was still. The footprints were not mine, but someone else's. Someone who knew this place. My mind raced through possibilities: a hunter, a hiker, maybe someone camping illegally. I felt exposed. My peaceful trip was suddenly tinged with unease. I decided to keep moving, sticking close to the creek. I wanted to find a new campsite for the night, somewhere hidden. After another hour, I found a small sandy bank behind thick bushes. I set up my tent quickly, making sure it was camouflaged by the surrounding trees. As I built my fire that evening, the sun slipped behind the hills, turning the sky orange and purple. I felt eyes on me, not in the supernatural sense, but that raw, human feeling of being watched. I checked the perimeter several times, but saw nothing. Night came again, cold and dark. I didn't hear footsteps, but the quiet was heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I barely slept. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by the crack of a branch breaking nearby. My heart thundered. I reached for the small flashlight and the pocket knife in my sleeping bag. The light beam caught movement, a shadow darting between the trees, too quick to see clearly. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath. The shadow paused, then vanished deeper into the forest. I debated what to do. I was alone, tired, unarmed except for a small knife, and miles from any help. The next morning, I packed up fast. I didn't want to stay, but I knew the trail back to the road was several miles away and involved crossing a dense part of the forest. As I walked, I noticed more signs: broken branches, disturbed leaves, and fresh footprints following mine at a distance. The sense of being hunted wasn't fear of an animal now. It was a person. My mind flipped through worst-case scenarios. Was this someone dangerous, or just another camper curious about who I was? I had no way to call for help. My phone was useless out here. I moved quickly, staying alert, watching behind me every few minutes. The forest around me was thick and shadowed, the trees closing in. The noise of the creek was faint now, swallowed by the dense growth. After 2 hours, I reached a ridge with a view of the road far below. Relief surged in me, but I knew I had to get down safely. The descent was steep, covered in loose soil and wet leaves. My boots slipped several times. Halfway down, I heard voices faintly, not shouts, but low murmurs. My heart sank. I crouched behind a fallen log, watching. A group of 3 men appeared, carrying rifles. They were dressed in hunting gear, moving carefully through the underbrush. I was terrified but knew I couldn't make noise. They didn't see me. They passed close, talking quietly about the guy we saw yesterday and tracking him for hours. The pieces clicked. They had been following me, assuming I was someone else. I stayed hidden until they moved away, then hurried down the slope. At the road, I flagged down a passing car and got a ride to the nearest ranger station. I reported what happened, giving descriptions of the men and the area. The rangers told me there had been some illegal hunting and poaching incidents in that forest recently. They warned me to be careful if I ever returned, but said the men would likely be investigated. I left the forest feeling shaken but grateful to be safe. The peacefulness I sought was replaced by a harsh reality. Sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts, but other people, and the wild places we think we can escape to. Back in my apartment days later, I unpacked my gear slowly, remembering every sound, every shadow, every heartbeat in that forest. I realized how fragile safety can be when you're alone, and how important it is to respect the unknown. Not just the wilderness, but the people who live alongside it. I never camped that deep in the woods alone again, but the trip changed me. It taught me to be careful, to trust my instincts, and that sometimes the silence you hear in the forest isn't empty, it's waiting. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. I was 26 years old, and after months of working long hours at a small tech company in Charlotte, I needed a break, something to clear my head and get away from the noise of city life. I had been camping a few times before, but always with friends. This time, I wanted complete silence and solitude, just me, the trees, and the wild. I left early on a Friday morning, carrying a heavy pack filled with the essentials. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cool nights, a small camp stove, enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and my trusty old compass. The weather was warm but not hot, and the sky was a clear blue. I told no one exactly where I was going except my sister, and even then only the general area. I felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness, the kind that comes with stepping into the unknown alone. The drive from Charlotte to the forest took about 3 hours. As I neared the dirt road that led to my chosen campsite, the pavement disappeared, and the road narrowed, twisting under towering pines and thick oaks. I parked at a small, almost hidden pullout where the official trailhead began. There were no signs or other cars around. I grabbed my pack and set off on foot down the narrow trail that wound into the dense forest. The trail was soft with pine needles and damp leaves. The smell of earth and moss filled the air. The forest was alive with sounds: distant birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, and the steady crunch of my boots on the ground. The sun filtered through the canopy in scattered rays, painting the forest floor with patches of golden light. Every so often, I spotted clusters of bright mushrooms or delicate wildflowers growing alongside the path. After about 2 hours of steady hiking, I found the spot I had planned to camp. It was a small clearing near a creek, a quiet, private place surrounded by tall trees. The creek was shallow but clear, the water running over smooth rocks with a soft, soothing murmur. The ground was flat and covered with soft pine needles. It was perfect. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was secure against any possible wind. The fabric was a deep green, blending almost seamlessly with the surrounding forest. I unpacked my gear and built a small fire pit ringed with stones. Gathering dry twigs and small branches, I started a fire using a simple lighter and some dry leaves as kindling. The fire crackled to life quickly, sending up a thin trail of smoke that mingled with the crisp forest air. As the afternoon faded into early evening, the forest began to darken. The sun slipped lower behind the trees, casting long shadows. The temperature dropped just a little, and I zipped up my jacket. I cooked a simple dinner of canned beans and rice heated over the small flame, eating slowly while watching the flames dance. The creek's water tinkled softly nearby, and the occasional call of a bird punctuated the quiet. The forest after dark was a different world. The trees stood like silent giants against the black sky, their leaves whispering with the gentle breeze. The stars came out one by one, and the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a pale river. I lay back on my sleeping pad inside the tent and listened. The sounds of the night were vivid: the soft hoot of an owl somewhere deep in the woods, the rustle of a small animal scurrying through the leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. It was peaceful, but also strange in a way I couldn't quite place. Around midnight, the wind picked up, sending cold drafts through the trees and making the tent fabric flutter. I pulled my jacket tighter and zipped up completely. Then I noticed something odd: a faint rustling not far from the creek, something that didn't sound like the usual forest noises. It was slow and steady, almost deliberate. At first, I thought it might be a deer or a raccoon, but then the sound stopped whenever I tried to listen closely, like it was waiting or watching. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks in the dark. But the noise came back, this time closer, on the other side of the creek. It was a soft scraping, like someone dragging a heavy branch over rocks or something being moved through the undergrowth. My heart rate sped up, but I told myself to stay calm. There was no way anyone else was out here this late, and there was no reason for anyone to be near my campsite. I kept my small flashlight next to me and stayed awake for a while, scanning the dark outside through the thin tent fabric. The moon was bright enough to cast shadows, but nothing was visible except the moving tree branches. After a while, the noises stopped, and I drifted into restless sleep. The next morning, I woke early with the first light, the forest bright and fresh. I checked around the campsite, expecting to see some evidence of whatever had made the noises: broken branches, footprints, or signs of disturbance. But everything looked normal. The fire pit was untouched, and the ground showed no signs of footprints near the creek except my own. The water was still clear, flowing quietly as before. I felt a little foolish for worrying, but that uneasy feeling lingered. I spent the day hiking along the creek, trying to focus on the beauty around me. The towering trees, the cool moss-covered rocks, the occasional glimpse of a deer or a squirrel. I refilled my water bottle at a small spring, taking care to use the purification tablets before drinking. The sun was warm, but the shade of the forest kept the air cool and comfortable. That night, I was even more alert. The sounds of the forest seemed sharper and louder in the dark, every crack or rustle making me tense up. I checked my supplies twice and kept my knife within reach. I stayed awake longer, staring into the shadows outside the tent, but I didn't hear anything unusual. Eventually, exhaustion won over, and I fell into a deep but uneasy sleep. On the third day, the weather changed. Clouds moved in, thick and gray, and a steady drizzle began by mid-afternoon. The dampness made the forest feel colder and heavier, the sounds muffled under the wet canopy. I stayed in the tent for a while, reading a worn paperback I'd brought along. When the rain eased, I decided to pack up and head back before the trails became too slippery and dangerous. As I broke camp and loaded my pack, I noticed something strange on the far side of the clearing near the creek. A small pile of rocks, arranged neatly in a loose circle. I hadn't put them there, and I hadn't seen them before. They looked freshly stacked, like someone had been there recently. My stomach tightened, and a wave of fear swept over me. I scanned the surrounding forest, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no disturbed leaves, nothing. Still, I felt watched, like eyes were on me just beyond the trees. I hurried to finish packing and started down the trail, my steps quick but careful on the slippery ground. About halfway back to the parking area, the feeling of being followed grew stronger. The forest was silent except for my own breathing and the soft splash of my boots on wet leaves. I stopped several times, listening hard, but nothing moved except the rain falling through the branches. Then, near a bend in the trail, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape darting between the trees. My heart hammered as I slowed and looked carefully, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was just a deer or a squirrel startled by my presence, but the uneasy feeling remained. I kept walking faster, my pack heavy on my back. The sky was darker now, the clouds thick and low. Then, not far from the trailhead, I found something that made me stop dead. A small, crudely made wooden stake stuck in the ground beside the trail. It was about 6 inches long, sharpened at one end, and had a rough symbol scratched into the wood. I had no idea what the symbol meant, but it looked old, like it had been weathered by rain and sun. A cold dread settled over me. Whoever had been here, whoever had left those rocks and this stake, had to be watching. Not just some random hiker, but someone who wanted to send a message. I scanned the trees again, feeling exposed and vulnerable in the open, with no shelter in sight. I broke into a jog, my mind racing with questions and fears. I wasn't sure what kind of person would do something like this in such a remote place, but I didn't want to find out. The road appeared just ahead, and soon after, my car. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, the forest behind me looked calm and normal in the fading light, but I knew it wasn't. It was a place that hid its dangers well, and some of those dangers were human, silent, and watching. Back in Charlotte, I called my sister and told her everything. The noises, the strange markings, the rocks. She insisted I report it to the park rangers, so I did the next day. The rangers listened carefully but said no one else had reported anything similar recently. They suggested it might have been a prank or some local tradition I didn't know about, but they took my concerns seriously and said they would patrol the area more. I haven't gone back to that part of the forest since. Sometimes, I think about the quiet watchfulness of those woods. I was 34 when I took a solo camping trip in the spring of 2022. It was something I had wanted to do for years but never had the time or nerve. I lived in Omaha, Nebraska, worked as a mechanic, and spent most of my days buried under car hoods and grease. I wasn't what most people would call outdoorsy, but I liked the idea of being alone in the woods, away from work, traffic, phones, and people in general. I figured a solo trip would clear my head. I picked a spot in northern Minnesota, close to the Canadian border, near a place called Lake Winton. It wasn't an official campground, just a patch of forest a couple miles off a logging road I found on a map. The area was remote enough that I wouldn't run into anyone, but accessible enough that I could hike in without getting lost. I took a week off work, packed up my gear, loaded it into my old Tacoma, and drove up there with plans to stay 4 nights. I arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. The last 30 miles were on gravel and dirt, winding through thick trees and climbing slowly uphill. There was still a bit of snow in the shaded parts of the woods, but the air felt mild. The spot I found was about 20 minutes off the road, hidden in a dense patch of pine and birch trees. There was a clearing not much bigger than a 2-car garage, with a slight slope down to a narrow creek that snaked away into the trees. The place felt untouched. No trash, no signs of other campers, no fire rings, just quiet woods and the sound of water. I set up my small 2-person tent on a flat spot under a tree, laid out my sleeping pad and bag, and boiled some water for coffee. I didn't do much that first night besides sit by the fire, listen to the wind, and eat a freeze-dried meal. When the sun went down, the cold moved in fast. I crawled into my bag early and lay there in the dark, listening to the woods. It took me a while to fall asleep, but eventually I did. The second day was easy. I hiked a couple of miles, followed the creek for a bit, then circled back. I found some deer tracks in the mud and a pile of moose droppings. Nothing unusual. I saw no people, no signs of anyone, just woods and more woods. That night, I built a better fire, cooked some sausage on a small skillet, and stared into the flames until my eyes hurt. It was peaceful, a kind of peace you don't get in a city. But when the fire burned down and I turned off my headlamp, the dark felt heavier. I started hearing things. Twigs snapping, something rustling in the brush. Not close, but not far either. I figured it was deer or maybe a raccoon. The third day is when things started to change. I woke up around 6 and noticed something strange. A boot print. It was near the edge of the clearing, just past my tent. At first I thought it was mine, but it was facing the wrong direction, coming toward the camp, not away. And it was bigger than my boot size, maybe by half an inch. It looked fresh too. The edges were sharp, not softened by wind or time. I stared at it for a while, then walked around the area to see if there were others. I found 3 more prints leading back into the woods. They went about 20 feet before disappearing into thicker ground cover. No trail, no path, just trees and underbrush. I tried to shake it off. Could have been a hunter passing through, I told myself. But the nearest town was 20 miles away, and the last stretch of road was rough. This wasn't a place someone would stumble into by accident. I didn't hear anyone during the night. No footsteps, no voices. Still, I couldn't deny the prints. Someone had come near my tent while I was sleeping. The air felt different after that, like the woods had eyes. I kept looking over my shoulder while I boiled water for oatmeal. I didn't hike that day. I stayed close to the camp, cleaned up, stacked wood, and sharpened my hatchet. I kept my knife on my belt and laid my small .22 pistol in the tent flap, just in case. I didn't expect trouble, but something felt off. I started noticing small things. A broken branch near the creek that hadn't been snapped the day before. A pine cone placed on top of my firewood pile. Just weird little things. Maybe they were nothing, but they added up. That night, I barely slept. I lay in the tent with my ears open, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something again. Not an animal. This was different. It was a slow, careful step, crunch, then pause. Then another. It circled the tent once, maybe twice. I held my breath and gripped the pistol under my bag. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The step stopped, then nothing. Just wind. I stayed like that until morning. When the sun came up, I went outside and looked around. No new prints. No sign of anyone. But I knew what I heard. Something had been out there. Something walking on 2 legs. I made coffee with shaking hands and sat by the fire, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but the other part didn't want to feel like I was being run off. I told myself I'd stay one more night and leave early the next morning. That day, I made noise. I chopped wood loudly, moved rocks, clanged metal. I wanted whatever or whoever was out there to know I wasn't scared. But inside, I kept glancing into the woods, expecting to see someone standing there. I never did. The trees stayed still. The woods stayed quiet, but the tension didn't leave. Around 5 that evening, I walked down to the creek to fill my water bottle. That's when I found something that changed everything. On the opposite bank, about 30 feet away, someone had tied a piece of red cloth to a branch. It wasn't there the day before. It looked like an old torn shirt sleeve, tied in a loose knot and dangling like a flag. I stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. That wasn't an accident. Someone had put it there. I filled the bottle and went straight back to camp. I packed up some gear and loaded it into my pack in case I needed to leave quickly. I kept the fire going until dark, then let it die out slowly. I ate a cold meal and sat in the tent, listening. I didn't even try to sleep. At around 1 in the morning, I heard movement again. This time, closer. It wasn't cautious like before. It was faster, 2 or 3 quick steps, then a thud like someone dropped something. I waited, straining to hear. Then silence again. After about 15 minutes, I unzipped the tent slowly and peeked out. The fire pit was empty. The woods looked normal, but something was lying near the base of a tree about 20 feet from the tent. I couldn't see clearly, so I turned on my headlamp and pointed it that way. It was a dead squirrel. Its neck was broken, and it was placed on a flat rock. Not chewed, not eaten, just killed and left there like a message. I stood frozen, staring at it. The squirrel's eyes were still open. I backed into the tent, zipped it up, grabbed my pistol, and sat with my back to the wall. My hands were sweating. I stayed that way for hours, listening, waiting. I didn't hear anything else, but I knew I wasn't alone. When the sky started turning gray, I packed everything in 15 minutes. I left the fire pit cold, the tent stakes behind, didn't even eat breakfast. I just threw everything in my bag and headed straight back to the truck. The hike back felt 10 times longer. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I didn't stop once, didn't look back. When I finally saw the road and the roof of my truck, I almost ran. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. Didn't stop until I hit pavement 2 hours later. When I got back to Omaha, I cleaned everything, stored the gear, and didn't talk about the trip to anyone. Not at first. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding paranoid. But something happened out there. Someone was watching me. I still don't know what they wanted or why they didn't do more. Maybe they were just messing with me. Maybe they were waiting to see what I'd do. I'm glad I left when I did. I haven't been camping since. I still have all the gear, but it stays in the basement now. Sometimes I think about going again, but then I remember that squirrel, the cloth on the branch, the boot prints, the way those woods felt on the 3rd night. I don't think it was about being in danger. I think it was about knowing I wasn't alone and never had been. That changes something in you. I used to think the woods were peaceful. Now I know they can hold things you'll never see, and sometimes they look right back at you. It was early September of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip up north, away from everything. I was 28 at the time, living in a small town in southern Oregon, working remotely and feeling burnt out from the summer. I hadn't taken a proper break in months, and I wanted a real escape, no phone, no people, no schedule. I looked up a few quiet forested areas and picked a spot near the Umpqua National Forest that looked remote but still reachable with my SUV. I didn't want a campground with other people or fire rings or bathroom stalls. I wanted quiet woods, untouched as much as possible. I packed everything over 2 days. I brought my tent, a sleeping bag good to 20 degrees, 2 camping stoves, enough food for 5 days, bear spray, water jugs, a filter, and 2 knives. I also brought a hatchet, a thick tarp, and a few emergency items like a thermal blanket and signaling mirror just in case. I made sure I had a backup power bank for my flashlight and headlamp, but I also packed a lot of batteries. I didn't want to depend on anything that might fail. I printed the topographic maps and triple-checked the weather. It was supposed to be dry all week, cool at night, and warm during the day. Perfect. The drive took me about 5 hours. I left at 6 a.m., stopped once for gas and coffee, then headed deeper into the forest. The paved road turned to gravel, and then it turned to packed dirt, and finally it was barely even that. I passed a few pull-offs, but I kept going until I found a bend near a thin creek and an old logging road that had long since been overtaken by grass and small trees. I parked under a thick canopy and walked about 15 minutes in, following the old road until it curved out of sight. The forest felt completely untouched. No tire tracks, no wrappers, no broken branches. Just the sound of wind pushing through pine needles and the distant trickle of water. I set up camp in a small flat area surrounded by tall trees. The forest was thick but not suffocating. I could still see sky above, and the canopy let in dappled light. I pitched my tent on a slight rise so water wouldn't pool if it rained. I put my food in a bear bag and slung it high between two trees, far from my tent. I cleared the area of sharp rocks and dug a small fire pit. I didn't plan on using it unless it got cold, but I like having one ready. I spent the first day just settling in. I filtered water from the creek, boiled a few cups, and made coffee. I walked a bit further down the old road and found some animal tracks. Maybe deer or elk, but nothing big. I didn't see anyone or hear anything human. That was exactly what I wanted. That first night was calm. The temperature dropped into the low 40s, but my sleeping bag held up. I slept pretty well. I woke once to the sound of something moving through the brush, but it wasn't close, and it didn't sound big. Just the kind of movement you hear in forests, little animals doing their thing. The second day I explored more, ate simple meals, read for a while, and just sat. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd done nothing. No music, no screens, no deadlines. Just breathing and watching the trees. I felt grounded in a way I hadn't in years. On the third day, around mid-afternoon, I noticed something that unsettled me. I'd hiked further out along the overgrown road, carrying my small day pack, when I saw what looked like a tarp. It was old and partially buried under sticks and needles, maybe 20 yards off the path. It wasn't bright-colored like mine, just faded green or brown, hard to see unless you were looking directly at it. I approached slowly, more curious than nervous. When I got closer, I saw it wasn't just a tarp. It was wrapped around something bulky. At first I thought it was just junk, maybe an old tent or gear someone abandoned. But it was too tight, almost like it was packed or wrapped deliberately. And it smelled off. Not rotten exactly, but like old wet cloth and mildew, with something sour underneath. I used a stick to lift a corner of it and saw stained fabric underneath, what looked like a sleeping bag or coat. But it was torn and full of pine needles, and the shape underneath wasn't right. I dropped the stick and stepped back. I didn't want to open it further. There was no gear scattered around, no backpack, no cooler, no signs of a campfire or shelter, just that tarp and whatever was inside it. I stood there for a minute, then looked around. Everything was quiet, too quiet, not even birds. My gut started to tighten. I marked the location on my paper map and hiked straight back to camp. Not running, but moving fast. I didn't want to draw attention, even if I didn't know to what. Back at camp, I packed my food tighter and brought my knife closer to my tent. I told myself it could have been nothing. Someone's old gear wrapped in a tarp. Maybe forgotten trash from years ago. But it didn't feel like that. I felt watched now. I didn't eat much that night. I kept my headlamp off and listened hard. A few times I thought I heard something moving, snaps, soft crunches, but they were distant, and I couldn't be sure. I slept with my knife under my pillow and one hand on my bear spray. The next morning, I debated leaving, but part of me wanted to wait it out. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was just too far from people and my mind was playing tricks. I stayed. I tried to go about my day, but I didn't go far from camp. I stayed within 50 feet and kept everything packed enough that I could leave quickly if I had to. That afternoon, I heard something strange. It was rhythmic, like someone knocking wood together. Not loud, but deliberate. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 2. I froze, listening. It came from the direction of that tarp. I didn't go check. I just waited. It didn't repeat. After a while, I didn't hear anything more, but my chest stayed tight the rest of the day. That night, I heard footsteps. Not animals scurrying, but heavy steps. They came around midnight, slow and steady, maybe 30 feet from my tent. I didn't move. I had no fire, no light, and I stayed dead still. The steps stopped for a while, then I heard a sound like metal scraping. Maybe a rock or something dragged. I didn't breathe for a minute straight. The steps moved off eventually, and I waited until sunrise before I moved again. To first light, I packed everything. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just got everything into my backpack, took down the tent, and tied it fast. I left no trace. I started walking back toward my SUV, trying to stay quiet but quick. It took longer because I kept looking back. The woods felt thick now, like they were closing in. I made it to the car and opened the back door, threw my pack inside, then paused. On the driver's side door, near the handle, there were streaks of dirt. Finger length, like someone with muddy hands had touched it. I hadn't noticed them before. I didn't stop to look. I jumped in, locked the doors, started the car, and backed out fast. I didn't even stop to check my phone until I was back on the main road. I drove straight back to town, 5 hours with no stops. When I got home, I called the ranger station, gave them the location as best I could, told them about the tarp and the shape under it, the smell, everything. They said they'd check it out. 2 weeks later, I got a call. The ranger I spoke to said they'd found the tarp and confirmed it was part of a very old campsite, at least a decade old. The remains were degraded, but there was some clothing and a sleeping bag. No signs of a struggle, no ID, no bones. Just layers of fabric and tarp, like someone had wrapped up their gear and never returned. They logged it, but they had no answers. He said it wasn't a crime scene, just one of many abandoned setups they find in remote areas. But he also said they found boot prints around it, fresh ones. Not mine, bigger. I don't go camping alone anymore. I still love the forest, still walk trails, still take my gear out sometimes. But I don't sleep out there alone now. Not because of ghosts or monsters or any story you'd tell by a fire. Just because some places have been too quiet for too long, and sometimes the only thing waiting out there is another person with no reason to leave you alone. And whatever was out there near that tarp, whatever was walking around my tent that night, they knew I was there. They probably watched me from the first day. They didn't make themselves known until they wanted to. And they let me leave. That's the part one think about most. They let me leave. That's why I never go back. I was 34 when I took a solo camping trip in the spring of 2022. It was something I had wanted to do for years, but never had the time or nerve. I lived in Omaha, Nebraska, worked as a mechanic, and spent most of my days buried under car hoods and grease. I wasn't what most people would call outdoorsy, but I liked the idea of being alone in the woods, away from work, traffic, phones, and people in general. I figured a solo trip would clear my head. I picked a spot in northern Minnesota, close to the Canadian border, near a place called Lake Winton. It wasn't an official campground, just a patch of forest a couple miles off a logging road I found on a map. The area was remote enough that I wouldn't run into anyone, but accessible enough that I could hike in without getting lost. I took a week off work, packed up my gear, loaded it into my old Tacoma, and drove up there with plans to stay 4 nights. I arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. The last 30 miles were on gravel and dirt, winding through thick trees and climbing slowly uphill. There was still a bit of snow in the shaded parts of the woods, but the air felt mild. The spot I found was about 20 minutes off the road, hidden in a dense patch of pine and birch trees. There was a clearing not much bigger than a 2-car garage, with a slight slope down to a narrow creek that snaked away into the trees. The place felt untouched. No trash, no signs of other campers, no fire rings, just quiet woods and the sound of water. I set up my small 2-person tent on a flat spot under a tree, laid out my sleeping pad and bag, and boiled some water for coffee. I didn't do much that first night besides sit by the fire, listen to the wind, and eat a freeze-dried meal. When the sun went down, The cold moved in fast. I crawled into my bag early and lay there in the dark, listening to the woods. It took me a while to fall asleep, but eventually I did. The second day was easy. I hiked a couple of miles, followed the creek for a bit, then circled back. I found some deer tracks in the mud and a pile of moose droppings. Nothing unusual. I saw no people, no signs of anyone, just woods and more woods. That night, I built a better fire, cooked some sausage on a small skillet, and stared into the flames until my eyes hurt. It was peaceful, a kind of peace you don't get in a city. But when the fire burned down and I turned off my headlamp, the dark felt heavier. I started hearing things. Twigs snapping, something rustling in the brush. Not close, but not far either. I figured it was deer or maybe a raccoon. The third day is when things started to change. I woke up around 6 and noticed something strange. A boot print. It was near the edge of the clearing, just past my tent. At first I thought it was mine, but it was facing the wrong direction, coming toward the camp, not away. And it was bigger than my boot size, maybe by half an inch. It looked fresh too. The edges were sharp, not softened by wind or time. I stared at it for a while, then walked around the area to see if there were others. I found 3 more prints leading back into the woods. They went about 20 feet before disappearing into thicker ground cover. No trail, no path, just trees and underbrush. I tried to shake it off. Could have been a hunter passing through, I told myself. But the nearest town was 20 miles away, and the last stretch of road was rough. This wasn't a place someone would stumble into by accident. I didn't hear anyone during the night. No footsteps, no voices. Still, I couldn't deny the prints. Someone had come near my tent while I was sleeping. The air felt different after that, like the woods had eyes. I kept looking over my shoulder while I boiled water for oatmeal. I didn't hike that day. I stayed close to the camp, cleaned up, stacked wood, and sharpened my hatchet. I kept my knife on my belt and laid my small .22 pistol in the tent flap, just in case. I didn't expect trouble, but something felt off. I started noticing small things. A broken branch near the creek that hadn't been snapped the day before. A pine cone placed on top of my firewood pile. Just weird little things. Maybe they were nothing, but they added up. That night, I barely slept. I lay in the tent with my ears open, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something again. Not an animal. This was different. It was a slow, careful step, crunch, then pause. Then another. It circled the tent once, maybe twice. I held my breath and gripped the pistol under my bag. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The step stopped, then nothing. Just wind. I stayed like that until morning. When the sun came up, I went outside and looked around. No new prints. No sign of anyone. But I knew what I heard. Something had been out there. Something walking on 2 legs. I made coffee with shaking hands and sat by the fire, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but the other part didn't want to feel like I was being run off. I told myself I'd stay 1 more night and leave early the next morning. That day, I made noise. I chopped wood loudly, moved rocks, clanged metal. I wanted whatever or whoever was out there to know I wasn't scared. But inside, I kept glancing into the woods, expecting to see someone standing there. I never did. The trees stayed still. The woods stayed quiet, but the tension didn't leave. Around 5 that evening, I walked down to the creek to fill my water bottle. That's when I found something that changed everything. On the opposite bank, about 30 feet away, someone had tied a piece of red cloth to a branch. It wasn't there the day before. It looked like an old torn shirt sleeve, tied in a loose knot and dangling like a flag. I stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. That wasn't an accident. Someone had put it there. I filled the bottle and went straight back to camp. I packed up some gear and loaded it into my pack in case I needed to leave quickly. I kept the fire going until dark, then let it die out slowly. I ate a cold meal and sat in the tent, listening. I didn't even try to sleep. At around 1 in the morning, I heard movement again. This time, closer. It wasn't cautious like before. It was faster, 2 or 3 quick steps, then a thud like someone dropped something. I waited, straining to hear. Then silence again. After about 15 minutes, I unzipped the tent slowly and peeked out. The fire pit was empty. The woods looked normal, but something was lying near the base of a tree about 20 feet from the tent. I couldn't see clearly, so I turned on my headlamp and pointed it that way. It was a dead squirrel. Its neck was broken, and it was placed on a flat rock. Not chewed, not eaten, just killed and left there like a message. I stood frozen, staring at it. The squirrel's eyes were still open. I backed into the tent, zipped it up, grabbed my pistol, and sat with my back to the wall. My hands were sweating. I stayed that way for hours, listening, waiting. I didn't hear anything else, but I knew I wasn't alone. When the sky started turning gray, I packed everything in 15 minutes. I left the fire pit cold, the tent stakes behind, didn't even eat breakfast. I just threw everything in my bag and headed straight back to the truck. The hike back felt 10 times longer. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I didn't stop once, didn't look back. When I finally saw the road and the roof of my truck, I almost ran. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. Didn't stop until I hit pavement 2 hours later. When I got back to Omaha, I cleaned everything, stored the gear, and didn't talk about the trip to anyone. Not at first. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding paranoid. But something happened out there. Someone was watching me. I still don't know what they wanted or why they didn't do more. Maybe they were just messing with me. Maybe they were waiting to see what I'd do. I'm glad I left when I did. I haven't been camping since. I still have all the gear, but it stays in the basement now. Sometimes I think about going again, but then I remember that squirrel, the cloth on the branch, the boot prints, the way those woods felt on the third night. I don't think it was about being in danger. I think it was about knowing I wasn't alone and never had been. That changes something in you. I used to think the woods were peaceful. Now I know they can hold things you'll never see, and sometimes they look right back at you. I was 34 that summer, just about to turn 35, and I had taken a week off work to go on a solo camping trip. It was something I started doing a few years earlier. I worked a quiet job as a mail sorter in Spokane, Washington, and most days passed by with not much change. I didn't have kids or a partner, and to be honest, I preferred being on my own most of the time. The outdoors gave me something I couldn't really explain. Space, I guess. Quiet, real quiet. And there was something calming about setting up camp, building fires, and just being away from all the constant noise of the world. This year, I decided to try a new place. I picked a spot I found online in a small, lesser-known section of the Clearwater National Forest in Idaho. It was July 2023, and I left early on a Tuesday morning with my backpack, tent, sleeping bag, a small cooler, and some gear. The plan was to hike in about 5 or 6 miles to a lake I had seen on a topographical map. It didn't even have a name on the map, just a round blue surrounded by forest, sitting at the base of a hill. It looked peaceful and remote, which was exactly what I wanted. The drive from Spokane took about 4 hours, with the last 45 minutes on rough gravel roads that twisted through dense trees. I passed 1 or 2 trucks parked near trailheads but didn't see anyone. When I finally parked, there was no one else in sight. I packed up my gear, locked the truck, and set off down the path. The trail wasn't marked and the area wasn't managed by rangers, but I had my GPS, a printed map, and a pretty good sense of direction. The hike was mostly downhill at first, winding through tall pines and patches of ferns, the sun breaking through the trees in dusty beams. It was hot but not unbearable. Bugs buzzed lazily around me, and I could hear birds in the distance. A few squirrels darted across the path. I was sweating within 20 minutes, but it felt good, real. After about 3 hours, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I expected, maybe 100 yards across, perfectly round, and so still that it looked like glass. Trees circled the entire shoreline, with a small open patch on the northern side where I set up camp. There was a flat spot perfect for the tent, and just a few feet away, the lake. I set everything up slowly. Tent first, then a small fire ring made from nearby rocks. Then I unpacked my food and gear. I didn't bring anything fancy, mostly canned stuff, trail mix, and a few MREs. The first night was perfect. I sat by the fire after dark, listening to the insects and the occasional splash from the water. Frogs or fish, probably. I watched the flames crackle and pop until I got tired. Then I crawled into the tent and slept like a rock. I woke up with the sun and spent the next day fishing from the edge of the lake. I didn't catch much, just a couple of small trout. But it didn't matter. I wasn't there to fill a cooler. I was there for the quiet. That second night, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything big, just little stuff. I was sitting by the fire again, same as before, when I thought I heard something moving in the trees behind me. It wasn't a big sound, more like a soft crunching, like someone slowly stepping on dry leaves. I turned and looked but didn't see anything. I figured it was a deer or some other animal, and after a while, the noise stopped. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder until I went to bed. The next morning, I found something strange. A stick had been jammed into the ground near the fire. I didn't put it there. It wasn't a branch that had fallen naturally either. It had been pushed down into the dirt at an angle, like someone used force to stick it upright. I stood there staring at it for a long time. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen or heard anyone, and this spot was deep enough in the woods that it was unlikely someone had just wandered by without me noticing. Still, I told myself it could have been there and I hadn't noticed. Or maybe an animal had moved it somehow, though I didn't know how. I pulled it out and tossed it into the trees. I tried to go about the day as normal. Went on a short hike, took some photos, read a little, but something about the stick stayed in my head. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises, faint ones, but just enough to keep me alert. A branch snapped at one point, not far from the tent. Then there was the sound of something moving through the brush. Not running, but slow, steady. I held my breath and sat up, listening, heart pounding. It stopped after a minute or two, and I eventually lay back down, but I never fully fell asleep again. I got up at first light, dead tired and on edge. When I stepped out of the tent, I froze. My cooler was open. It had been shut and latched the night before, and now the lid was wide open, and 2 of the MREs were gone. I hadn't heard it open during the night. There were no drag marks or animal prints around it. It looked like someone had walked up, opened it, taken what they wanted, and walked off. I looked around, but the ground was mostly pine needles, and I couldn't see any clear tracks. That was when I started to think seriously about leaving. It wasn't just nerves anymore. Someone was out there, watching, maybe even walking through my camp while I slept. I packed up everything except the tent. I figured I'd stay one more night and leave early the next morning. I just didn't want to hike back tired and anxious. That was a mistake. The final night was worse than all the others combined. I built up the fire bigger than usual, trying to keep the area well lit. I stayed close to it, feeling every shift in the wind, every crack of a twig. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time it was clear footsteps, soft but steady, coming from the other side of the lake. I couldn't see much through the trees, but I was sure someone was there. I turned off my headlamp, crouched by the fire, and waited. The steps stopped. Then I heard them again, this time farther to the right, like they had circled part of the lake. I waited there for an hour, maybe more. Nothing, just silence. I finally crawled into the tent, fully clothed, knife in hand, and lay there in the dark. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Sometime near dawn, I heard a soft zip, the sound of a tent zipper. Mine. I sat up instantly, heart racing, and lunged toward the flap, knife ready. But no one was there. The zipper was halfway down, like someone had started to open it, then stopped. I leapt outside, spinning around, eyes scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Whoever it was, they were gone. I tore the tent down in record time, barely bothering to pack it neatly. I shoved everything into my pack, grabbed the rest by hand, and took off down the trail. My legs were shaking, and I kept checking over my shoulder. The morning was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just the wind. I walked fast, faster than I should have with all the gear, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. The hike back felt twice as long. I kept thinking I heard someone behind me, catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I looked, nothing was there. By the time I reached the truck, I was soaked with sweat and shaking all over. I tossed everything in the back, locked the doors, and drove until I hit pavement. I didn't stop once, not even for gas. When I got home, I filed a report online with the local Forest Service. I didn't have much to go on, no pictures, no names, no plates, but I gave them the GPS coordinates and told them everything. They followed up a few days later, said they'd check it out, but I never heard back. I don't think they found anything. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still hike sometimes, but always close to home and never overnight. I bought security cameras for my apartment. I lock every window at night. I know it sounds paranoid, but when you wake up in the dark and find out someone was standing inches from you, watching you sleep, it does something to you, changes you. I wasn't hurt, and I got out safe, but I think about that last night more than I want to admit. Someone was out there in the woods with me, not lost, not stumbling through. They knew exactly what they were doing. They watched me, took my food, opened my tent, and I never saw their face, never heard their voice. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did. I'm glad I'll never know. I was 34 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It was late September of 2021, just as the leaves were starting to change and the summer crowds had thinned out. I'd been working a lot of overtime in Detroit and felt like I was running on fumes. I hadn't taken any time off in months, and I needed to clear my head. I didn't want anything fancy, no campgrounds with showers or RVs, just some real, quiet woods. I picked an area near the Hiawatha National Forest, around a lesser-known trail that looped a few miles around a lake. The map marked a few primitive campsites spaced far apart, which was exactly what I wanted. Solitude, quiet, nature. I packed up my small hatchback with what I needed: tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, dried food, water purifier, first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, a knife, and some clothes for layering. I also brought a bear spray canister, though the area wasn't known for much bear activity. Still, I like to be cautious. I drove for nearly 8 hours, crossed the Mackinac Bridge, and made it to a dirt road that led deep into the woods. I parked where the trailhead began, locked up the car, threw on my pack, and started hiking. The trail was peaceful. I didn't see another person, just birds, the rustle of chipmunks, and the occasional gust of wind blowing leaves from the trees. After hiking for about 2 hours, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I expected, more of a pond, really, but the air was fresh, and the light hit the water just right. I picked a flat spot with a view of the water and started setting up camp. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire, cooked a dehydrated meal, and sat by the flames until they burned low. There was something about the silence that made me feel calm and alert at the same time. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, laying on my back and listening to the crickets outside until I fell asleep. The second day, I decided to follow a small offshoot trail that ran along the edge of the lake. I packed a small day bag and left most of my gear back at camp. The trail wasn't well marked, but it was visible enough to follow. It hugged the shoreline before turning uphill into denser woods. I didn't bring my phone, no signal out there anyway. I just had my compass and a printed map with a rough layout of the area. After walking about 45 minutes, I came across a clearing where a few logs had fallen, and the ground looked disturbed, like someone had camped there not long ago. There was no tent or fire pit, just a few broken branches and a flattened patch where grass had been trampled. I noticed a small piece of cloth stuck in a bush, like part of a jacket or a backpack strap. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe someone camped illegally and left in a hurry. I kept walking. Then, about 20 minutes later, I heard something behind me, a soft rustling, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I stopped and looked around. Nothing. I stood still for maybe a full minute, scanning the trees. The wind had picked up a bit, and leaves swirled across the ground, but there was no other sound. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon and kept moving. I made it back to my camp by late afternoon. Everything was the way I left it, though I felt strangely unsettled. Not scared, just uneasy. I made dinner early and watched the water turn dark as the sun dipped behind the trees. I didn't build a fire that night. I didn't feel like sitting out in the open. Instead, I sat inside the tent with my lantern on low and read a paperback novel until my eyes got heavy. Just before I turned the lantern off, I heard that same rustling sound again. This time closer. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like someone trying to move quietly but not quite succeeding. I froze. My breathing slowed, and I held my hand near the knife I kept next to me when I slept. I waited, listening, not moving a muscle. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I waited longer, maybe 10 minutes, then turned the lantern off and laid down. I didn't sleep well that night. Every crack of a branch or rustle of a leaf made me flinch. The next morning, I unzipped the tent slowly and looked outside. Everything seemed normal, but when I walked around the back of the tent, I noticed something strange. There were prints in the dirt that hadn't been there before. Not boot prints, just slight depressions like someone had been walking barefoot or in socks. They were faint, hard to notice unless you looked closely, but they circled the tent. Not in a straight line, more like someone had paced around it a few times. I stood there for a long time, staring at the ground. I told myself maybe it was an animal, maybe I was imagining it, but the feeling in my stomach said otherwise. I packed up my camp that morning, even though I had planned to stay 2 more nights. I didn't want to be there anymore. I didn't like the idea of someone wandering around out there watching me. I decided to hike the loop trail back to the car, but instead of following the trail clockwise the way I came in, I took it counterclockwise, thinking it would be shorter. That was a mistake. The map didn't show how overgrown the trail was on that side. Fallen trees blocked parts of it, and I had to push through dense underbrush. After about an hour of struggling through that, I realized I wasn't on the trail anymore. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. I didn't panic, not right away. I took out my compass and tried to head west, back toward the lake. But the trees were so thick I couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The sky was gray, and the sun was no help. I kept moving, thinking eventually I'd hit the trail or at least the lake. That's when I found something I wasn't expecting. An old shack, hidden between trees. It wasn't on the map. The structure looked half-rotten, like it had been there for decades. The roof sagged in the middle and one side had collapsed. I didn't want to go near it, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached slowly, looking for any signs of life. There was no smell, no smoke, no sound. But someone had been there recently. The ground around the shack was cleared, and I saw fresh footprints in the mud, boot prints this time. Inside, there were some old tools, rusted cans, and a stack of firewood that looked freshly chopped. I didn't touch anything. I just backed away and kept walking. I felt watched again, that same pressure on the back of my neck. I moved faster, pushing through the trees until I couldn't hear my own footsteps anymore. At one point, I stopped to catch my breath and drink some water. That's when I saw it. Someone had built a lean-to not far from where I stood. It looked temporary, just some sticks and a tarp, but it wasn't old. There was a small pile of trash next to it, cans, wrappers, a plastic fork. All recent. I turned around and left as fast as I could. I walked for hours, keeping my compass pointed west, but I didn't find the lake. The woods stretched endlessly, and every direction looked the same. Around late afternoon, I stopped, exhausted, and climbed a small ridge to get a better view. When I got to the top, I could just barely make out the glint of water through the trees. I headed that way. By the time I reached the lake again, the sun was low. I didn't stop. I followed the shoreline until I found the trail, then followed it back to the trailhead. My legs were burning and my feet ached, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be out of those woods. When I got to the car, it was untouched. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and drove without stopping until I reached a gas station an hour away. I sat there for a long time just breathing. I didn't call the police. I didn't report the shack or the lean-to or the footprints. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want them to ask questions I didn't have answers to. That night, I checked into a cheap motel and slept for 12 hours straight. I kept waking up every time I heard something outside the window, but I was safe. I knew I was safe. It's been almost 4 years since that trip, and I haven't gone camping alone again. I still hike. I still love nature, but I stick to busy trails now, the kind where I can see other people and hear the occasional passing voice. I learned something on that trip, something simple but important. The woods are beautiful, but they're not empty. Not always. And sometimes, the scariest thing you can find out there isn't a bear or a storm or getting lost. It's realizing that someone else is out there with you, watching, waiting. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from work and spend some time alone in the mountains. It was late September 2019. I had been working as a mechanic in a small town in Idaho, and between the long hours and the constant stream of customers, I was getting burned out. I didn't have kids or a partner, just a dog named Max and a small one-bedroom house I hardly saw the inside of except to sleep. I needed a change of pace. One of my old co-workers told me about a cabin his family owned in the woods near Eureka, Montana. It wasn't fancy, just a one-room log place near a small lake, with a propane heater, a wood stove, and a hand pump for water. No electricity, no cell service, no people. That was exactly what I wanted. I got the keys from him, packed up my truck with supplies, cans of soup, rice, beans, water jugs, a couple of lanterns, a pile of firewood, a sleeping bag, and some tools, and drove up into the hills early one morning. It took about 4 hours to reach the turnoff from the highway, then another hour creeping along a narrow dirt road through the forest until I found the trail that led to the cabin. I parked off to the side, locked the truck, and carried my gear the rest of the way in. The cabin sat about 200 yards from the edge of a calm little lake, surrounded by pine and spruce. There was a fire pit out front, a rusted old bench that wobbled when I sat on it, and a sagging wooden dock that stuck out into the water. The air smelled clean, like pine needles and damp earth. It was quiet except for the occasional creak of trees and the distant call of birds. I set up my stuff, checked the propane tank, it was half full, and took a walk around the lake to get my bearings. There was nobody out here, just me, the trees, and the water. The first few days were peaceful. I woke up early, made instant coffee on my little camp stove, and sat on the porch watching the sun rise through the trees. I spent most of the day fishing, chopping wood, walking around the area, and reading old paperback novels I brought. At night, I lit the lanterns, heated up a can of soup, and sometimes sat by the fire pit watching the stars until it got too cold. It was exactly what I needed. I didn't see a single other person. No planes overhead. No cars in the distance. Just quiet. On the 5th night, things started to feel off. It was just past midnight. I had gone to bed around 10, bundled up in my sleeping bag with a couple of wool blankets on top. The propane heater was hissing softly in the corner, taking the edge off the cold. I was half asleep when I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just a crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. At first I thought it was an animal. There were deer out here, maybe elk. Could have been a bear, but it didn't sound that heavy. It was slow and deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard. I sat up and held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped for a minute, then started again, circling around the cabin. I had a flashlight next to the bed, so I clicked it on and shined it toward the window. Nothing, just trees. I stayed like that for maybe 20 minutes, heart pounding, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Eventually, I heard the steps fade into the woods. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was mostly pine needles and dry dirt, not great for prints, but I found a few spots near the back where something had disturbed the ground. It looked like shoe prints, not boots either, more like sneakers. That didn't make sense. There weren't any trails nearby. You couldn't even drive all the way in. If someone was out here, they had hiked in, which was weird enough. But walking around someone's cabin in the middle of the night, that wasn't right. I didn't have a gun with me, just a hatchet and a heavy wrench I kept by the bed. I started locking the cabin door with the old iron latch every night, even though I didn't think it would stop anyone from kicking it in if they really wanted to. I also brought the hatchet inside and set it within arm's reach. Every little sound put me on edge. The crack of a branch, the wind shifting through the trees. It all made my skin crawl. The next 2 nights were quiet. I started to think maybe it really was just an animal, or maybe someone passing through, maybe a hunter. But on the 8th night, I woke up to the sound of metal tapping against glass. It was soft and rhythmic, like someone tapping a coin or a key against the window pane. I stayed perfectly still. The flashlight was under my blanket this time, but I didn't move. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know I was awake. The tapping continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I waited. Nothing happened. I didn't even hear footsteps this time, just silence. After what felt like an hour, I finally got up and looked out. Nothing. But in the morning, I saw what looked like a smudge on the window, like someone had touched it with dirty fingers. 3 marks, about a foot apart, like a hand had been pressed against the glass. I walked around again. This time I found something that made my stomach turn. About 50 feet into the trees, behind the cabin, I found a dead rabbit hanging from a branch. Its body was cleanly skinned, and its head was missing. There was no blood on the ground. Someone had strung it up like a warning. I backed away slowly and went straight to the cabin. That day, I kept the hatchet on my belt and didn't leave the clearing. I started thinking about leaving early, but the truck was a good half-mile walk through the woods, and I didn't want to risk running into whoever was out there while I was exposed. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lanterns lit and sat in the corner with the hatchet across my knees, listening to every sound. The tapping didn't come back, but around 2 a.m., I heard something hit the roof. A single thud like a rock or a heavy branch. Then another. I didn't go outside. I just waited for it to stop. Around dawn, I finally dozed off for a couple hours. When I got up, I found small rocks scattered around the front of the cabin. Some had clearly hit the walls. One had broken a piece of the wooden window frame. I decided that was it. I packed up as fast as I could, stuffing everything into my backpack and grabbing only what I needed. I left the rest. I took the wrench and the hatchet and started walking fast down the trail to where my truck was parked. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. When I reached the truck, I froze. Someone had slashed one of the rear tires. The rubber was torn straight through, deep enough that I couldn't drive on it. I had a spare, but changing it meant kneeling down and turning my back on the woods. I stood there for 5 minutes, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No sound. I finally unlocked the door, got the jack out, and started working as fast as I could. Halfway through swapping the tire, I heard a branch snap behind me. I spun around with the wrench raised. Nothing, just the trees again. I kept going. Every few seconds, I turned to check behind me. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped one of the lug nuts in the dirt and had to dig around for it. When I finished, I threw the tools in the bed and slammed the door shut. I got behind the wheel and took off down the dirt road faster than I should have. The truck bounced and jolted over the rocks, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to the main road. It took 20 minutes to reach the pavement. When I finally got cell signal again, I pulled over and sat there for a while, trying to calm down. My hands were still shaking. I didn't report anything to the sheriff. I didn't know what to say. That someone was messing with me in the woods? That they left a skinned rabbit and tapped on my window at night? It felt crazy, and I didn't want to stick around for someone to decide I was wasting their time. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked my coworker about it either. A few weeks later, I sold most of my camping gear and told myself I was done with solo trips. The quiet I had wanted so badly turned out to be something else entirely. Something I didn't understand. A year later, I read an article online about a missing hiker in the same area. They found his camp, but not him. Just a burned-out fire and his backpack, half buried in leaves. No sign of a struggle. No blood. No tracks. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I stayed one more night. If I had gone outside when I heard the noise. If I hadn't had a spare tire. But I don't dwell on it. I got out. I was lucky. That's enough for me. I was 34 when I took a week off from work and decided to spend it alone in a small rental cabin up in northern Michigan. It was the fall of 2022, the kind of fall where the air stays cool during the day and drops close to freezing at night. The leaves had already started changing, and the forest around the area looked like it was glowing in red, orange, and yellow. I had rented a cabin through a small local agency I found online. It was privately owned by an older couple who didn't use the internet much, so the agency handled everything for them. It was cheap too, which I found strange at the time, but I didn't really question it. I just figured they wanted someone to stay there during the slow season. The cabin was about 20 minutes from the nearest gas station and a good 35 from any grocery store. It was deep in the woods, about a mile down a narrow dirt road that veered off from the main highway. I drove a black 2009 Jeep Cherokee back then. It handled the dirt road fine, but the last part of the trail was a mess. Fallen branches, shallow ditches, and soft patches of dirt made me slow to a crawl for the last 100 yards or so. The cabin sat at the bottom of a small hill, mostly surrounded by trees except for the clearing in front where I parked. It was a simple place, nothing fancy. A single-floor structure with faded red paint, a wraparound porch, and a stone chimney on the side. The inside had a small living area, a wood-burning stove, a kitchenette, a bathroom, and one bedroom. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and barely any phone signal. That was fine by me. I wanted to get away from people, from work, from noise. The first day went by quietly. I spent most of it unpacking, collecting some firewood from the piles out back, and getting used to the cold smell inside the cabin. That mix of old wood, dust, and something faintly earthy, like the place hadn't been opened up in a long time. I slept okay that night, though I kept waking up to the sound of wind pressing against the walls and trees creaking outside. It wasn't scary exactly, just new. The second day, I decided to explore the area a little. I followed a small trail that curved past the back of the cabin and went deeper into the woods. It didn't look like a proper hiking trail, more like something animals had made, but it was easy to follow. I walked for maybe 40 minutes before I turned around. I passed an old shed about halfway in, but I didn't check it out. It looked like it was falling apart. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something weird. The firewood stack behind the house had a few logs missing. Not a big deal. Maybe I had taken more than I thought earlier, but it stuck in my head. I remembered placing 10 logs near the back porch, and now there were only 5. I shrugged it off. Probably forgot. That night, around 1 in the morning, I heard footsteps on the porch. I sat up in bed, completely still. The sound wasn't animals. It was slow, heavy, and deliberate. Someone walking, then silence. I stayed awake until the sky started to lighten. Never saw anything when I finally checked, but there were scuff marks on the porch steps. That's when the feeling of being alone stopped being relaxing and started being uncomfortable. I made sure to lock the door the next night. The windows too. I even put a chair under the doorknob like they do in old movies. I didn't sleep well. Every creak in the floor or gust of wind outside made me flinch. But nothing happened that night. The third day, I tried to call someone. My phone had no signal, not even enough to text. I went out to the front yard and climbed partway up the hill to get some bars. But even then, I couldn't connect. Later that day, I found something strange in the woods. I had gone back out along the same trail, just for something to do. This time, I went farther past the shed and saw a bunch of small items scattered under a tree. A cracked flashlight, a rusted knife, a ripped backpack with some faded red on the side, and a crushed soda can that looked like it had been stepped on repeatedly. It looked like someone had dumped a bunch of junk out here a long time ago. I stood there for a while trying to make sense of it. Nothing was valuable, just stuff that someone left behind or didn't want anymore. Still, it felt weird, like it wasn't meant to be found. That night, I heard the footsteps again, louder this time. I froze in bed. They circled the cabin. Slow. I could hear the wood creaking under their weight. Once they reached the backside, I heard a soft scraping sound, like someone was dragging something across the wall. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. After 10 minutes, it stopped. I waited another 30 before getting up. I peeked out the window. I didn't see anyone, but there were faint marks in the dirt below, like something had been dragged through it. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, I packed up some food, water, and my folding knife and decided I was going to leave. I'd had enough. When I got to my Jeep, I saw the front tires had been slashed. Not punctured, slashed. Clean cuts, like someone had used a razor or knife. I stood there for a long time just staring. My heart was racing. I looked around, listening, but the woods were quiet. Too quiet. I opened the trunk and grabbed the tire repair kit, but it was useless with slashes like that. I didn't have spares. Just the one emergency donut that wouldn't do any good with both fronts gone. I thought about walking back to the main road. It would take hours, maybe longer, but I didn't know who or what was out there anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Instead, I stayed in the cabin for another night, kept the fire going, didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard scratching again, this time on the side of the cabin near the bedroom. Not animals. It was slow, like someone dragging nails or a piece of metal along the wood. I turned off all the lights and sat in the corner with the knife in my hand, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. In the morning, I found marks, long, shallow scratches on the wall outside. Whoever it was, they were trying to scare me. It was working. I tried walking up the trail that led to the highway, but I stopped about a mile in when I heard something behind me. Footsteps, not heavy, but fast, like someone trying to catch up while staying out of sight. I turned around and saw nothing. I ran back to the cabin, locked the door, and blocked it with furniture. That day, I made a plan. At first light, I'd pack a bag, take my knife, and hike the 6 or 7 miles to the nearest road. I'd head east, through the trees, cutting across the hills if I had to. I wasn't going to wait around another night. But just before dusk, I saw something that changed everything. I was sitting on the porch, clutching my knife, just staring into the woods, when I noticed something shiny in the distance. I walked out a bit to get a better look. There was a small motion-activated camera nailed to a tree about 30 yards away, pointing directly at the cabin. It was old, but it had a red light blinking on the front. It was still working. Someone was watching me. I didn't know what that meant exactly, but I knew it wasn't good. The way things had been happening, the way I'd been pushed into fear, this wasn't random. Someone wanted me afraid. Someone wanted to see what I'd do. I went back to the cabin, took out a notepad I'd brought, and started writing everything down. Times, details, what I'd seen. I figured if something happened to me, at least there would be a record. I wrapped the pages in plastic and shoved them into a crack behind the wood stove. That night, I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no scratching, nothing. But I didn't sleep either. I sat there in the dark, waiting. At dawn, I packed up and left. I didn't follow the trail. I moved directly east through the woods, checking my compass every few minutes, climbing ridges, crawling under fallen trees, cutting through thick brush. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I walked for hours. Around noon, I finally hit a gravel service road. About half an hour later, a truck came by and I flagged it down. The guy inside was a utility worker doing checks on power lines. He took one look at me, dirty, scratched up, wide-eyed, and didn't ask many questions. He gave me water, let me use his radio, and drove me to a station back in town. I reported everything. The cabin, the slashed tires, the scratching, the camera in the woods. They sent a deputy out there. He called back a few hours later. Said the cabin was empty. Said he didn't find a camera. Said the place looked old but fine. I could tell from the way he said it, he didn't believe me. Or maybe he didn't care. I never went back to get the Jeep. I told the rental agency what happened, and they didn't say much. Just apologized and refunded me without asking for details. That was it. A few weeks later, I tried to find the listing again. It was gone. So was the agency website. I checked property records and found nothing matching the name of the owners or that cabin's location. Like it never existed. But I know it did. I still think about that camera, the footsteps, the way it all felt like a game to someone. Not a ghost, not a monster. Person. Someone who liked to watch people break down in fear. Someone who made sure no one believed the ones who survived. It's been 3 years since. It was early October of 2017 when I decided to spend a week alone at my uncle's old hunting cabin up in northern Idaho. The cabin had been sitting unused for a while after he passed, and no one in the family seemed interested in maintaining it. I was 32 at the time and working from home as a freelance graphic designer, so I had the freedom to pack up and spend a week or two somewhere quiet. I wanted a break from the internet, my phone, and the constant buzz of city noise in Boise. I thought the isolation might clear my head. The cabin was about 3 hours north of Coeur d'Alene, tucked deep into the Panhandle National Forest. It wasn't accessible by a main road. I had to drive my truck along a gravel trail for over 20 minutes after turning off the highway. The further I drove, the less maintained the path got. Fallen branches scraped the sides of the truck, and potholes jolted me in my seat. I stopped once to move a downed limb and again to double-check the directions I scribbled down from an old map. There wasn't a single bar of cell reception. The air was colder up there, and the pine trees were packed in thick on both sides. When I finally saw the clearing with the cabin in the middle, I remember feeling relieved and a little nervous at the same time. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. I'd been there once as a teenager with my uncle on a short hunting trip, but back then it felt bigger and more alive. Now, it was just a weathered wooden structure with faded red paint, half covered by pine needles and moss. The roof was sagging slightly, but it looked intact. A metal chimney poked through the top. The front steps creaked loudly under my boots as I unlocked the rusted padlock on the door. Inside, the air smelled like dry wood, old smoke, and dust. There was no electricity, no running water. Just a wood-burning stove, a small bed with a wool blanket, a table with 2 chairs, and a shelf with some old tools and canned food. There was also a small bathroom out back, just a pit toilet really. I had brought bottled water, food, a lantern, firewood, and a camping stove, enough to get me through at least 10 days. That first day, I spent most of the time airing the place out, sweeping the floors and unpacking. I cleaned out a mouse nest in one of the cabinets and found a few dead spiders in the corners. As the sun dipped below the trees, the whole forest turned gold for a moment before going dark. I started a fire in the stove, cooked a can of chili on the small propane burner, and settled into the quiet. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. Just the crackling of the fire, the wind pushing through the trees outside, and the occasional creak of the old boards under the cabin. I went to sleep early that night with the lantern dimmed low beside me. The second day, I took a long hike around the area. There was a faded trail behind the cabin that led down toward a shallow creek. I followed it for about an hour, marking the trees with little bits of orange flag tape so I wouldn't get lost. The water was freezing, but I washed my face and hands in it anyway. It felt good to be away from everything, to breathe air that didn't smell like exhaust fumes. I saw deer tracks, a few squirrels, and what might have been a bear print, though it was old and partially washed out. I didn't bring a gun, just a knife and bear spray clipped to my belt. I figured that was enough if I was careful. That night, the wind picked up hard. I could hear it howling through the trees, making the walls of the cabin groan. A few times I thought I heard footsteps outside, but it was probably just the wind knocking branches around. I told myself that more than once. Still, I didn't sleep well. I kept the fire going low through the night and stayed under the blanket, listening. Every small noise seemed louder out there. Every crack of wood, every rustle outside. On the third day, I noticed something strange. Just after noon, I was sitting on the front step drinking instant coffee when I saw a figure moving through the trees about 100 yards off to the east. It was fast, just a flash of movement, but I caught the shape of a person, maybe wearing a brown or green jacket. I stood up and tried to get a better look, but whoever it was had already vanished into the trees. I waited a while, scanning the tree line, then walked out a bit in that direction, calling out just in case it was a hunter or hiker who might be lost. No one answered. There weren't supposed to be any other cabins nearby. The nearest property was miles away. Eventually, I shrugged it off and went back to the cabin, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started locking the door at night after that, even though it was just a wooden latch. That evening, I thought I heard movement outside again. Not branches this time, something softer, like footsteps in the grass or dirt. I turned off the lantern and sat by the stove, listening hard. It stopped after a few minutes. When I finally opened the door and looked out with a flashlight, there was nothing. No footprints I could see, no eyes shining in the beam, just trees and more trees. I didn't sleep well again that night. On the fourth day, I found boot prints behind the cabin. They were faint, like someone had walked through while the ground was still soft from the night's dew. They weren't mine. The tread was different, and I hadn't been out back that morning. I followed them a little ways before they disappeared into the brush. That unsettled me more than I expected. I spent the next hour checking around the cabin, looking for signs of anything disturbed. Firewood moved, footprints near the steps, anything out of place. I didn't find anything else. Still, I started keeping my knife close. I put the bear spray on the table next to where I slept. Later that afternoon, I walked back down to the creek. I needed to clear my head, and the sound of running water usually helped. But when I got there, I saw something that stopped me cold. There were 2 cigarette butts near a log by the creek, fresh, not rained on or decayed. I don't smoke, and I hadn't seen those there before. Someone had been down there, probably recently. I didn't stay long. On the way back, I kept looking over my shoulder. The trees felt closer somehow, like they were leaning in around me. That night, I didn't light the stove. I didn't want the smoke or the glow of the fire giving away my position. I sat in the dark with the lantern off, just watching the windows. I don't know what I expected. Nothing happened, but the feeling of being watched never left. At one point, just after midnight, I thought I heard something scrape lightly against the outside wall. Not hard, just a faint drag, like a branch or a hand brushing along the wood. I held my breath until the sound stopped. By the 5th day, I was tired, not just physically, but mentally. I started making plans to leave early. I figured I'd stay one more night and then pack up in the morning. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but something wasn't right. Too many small things were piling up. I spent the day stacking wood inside the cabin, preparing food, and cleaning up so I could leave quickly if I needed to. I even walked out to the trail leading to my truck to make sure it was clear. That night, I locked the door tight and placed a chair under the latch. I kept the bear spray next to me and my boots on. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the latch moving. Very softly, I stayed completely still, eyes wide open in the dark. The chair under the latch creaked slightly, then silence. I reached for the bear spray slowly and held it in both hands, heart pounding. I didn't move. After what felt like an hour, I heard faint footsteps moving away from the cabin, crunching through leaves and pine needles. The first light, I opened the door. The chair had been pushed slightly. There were fresh prints in the dirt outside the step. Clear ones, not mine. They led off toward the woods in the same direction I'd seen the figure days before. I didn't follow them. I just shut the door, packed everything as fast as I could, and hauled it to my truck. The entire time, I felt like I was being watched from the trees. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The drive out felt longer than the drive in. Every branch that scraped the truck made me flinch. When I finally reached the paved road and got reception, I pulled over and just sat there for 10 minutes. I messaged a friend in town to let them know I was coming. I didn't even tell them everything at first. I just needed to be around people again. I never found out who was out there. I reported it to the local ranger station when I got back. They said there had been a few trespassing complaints that summer, probably squatters or hunters going too far off trail. They took my name and said they'd send someone to check the cabin, but I never heard anything after that. I didn't go back. Since then, I've thought about it a lot. The prints, the cigarettes, the sounds at night. Someone was out there. Maybe just one person, maybe more. Maybe they were just curious, or maybe they were waiting for the right moment. I'll never know, but I know what I felt, and I trust that feeling now more than ever. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. Not because I'm afraid of bears or getting lost. I'm afraid of people, the ones who don't want to be found, the ones who watch without ever saying a word. The ones who move just beyond the edge of your vision. The ones who leave nothing but footprints and cigarette butts behind. And I'll never forget the sound of that latch trying to lift in the dark. Not ever. It was early November of 2016 when I decided to take a break from everything. I'd been working a construction job just outside of Boulder, Colorado, and after almost 9 months straight with barely a weekend off, I felt burned out. I was 37 at the time, divorced, no kids, and lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment near the edge of town. I wasn't really close to anyone, and I think the isolation had started to get to me without me even realizing it. One night after work, I was scrolling through a local classified site and saw an ad for a remote cabin rental in a place called Jackson Creek, about a 2-hour drive west into the hills. The ad said it had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, no television, just a small wood stove, running water, and a couple of beds. It sounded perfect. I figured I'd go out there for a week, bring some groceries and a stack of old books I never got around to reading, and just shut off everything for a while. I packed light, a duffel bag with clothes, some tools just in case, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a few other odds and ends. I filled a cooler with meat, bread, cheese, water, beer, and a few canned things. It was cold enough that time of year that I wasn't too worried about food going bad. I had a few propane canisters and a small camping stove as backup for cooking if the wood stove wasn't enough. I tossed everything into my old Tacoma and set out around noon on a Sunday. The drive started out normal, highways and back roads, lots of yellow leaves still clinging to the trees. But the last half hour was nothing but narrow, winding dirt roads with potholes and big patches of loose gravel. The higher I climbed, the thinner the air got, and the colder it felt. My cell signal vanished somewhere along the way, which didn't surprise me. I followed the directions from the owner, a guy named Larry, who'd written out a detailed set of turns and landmarks, since GPS wouldn't work up there. Eventually, I saw the small wooden sign nailed to a tree that read, Jackson Creek, 1 mile, and kept going. The cabin sat on a slight incline, surrounded by tall pines and a few dead trees that looked like they'd been struck by lightning. It was a simple one-story structure with a small front porch, a chimney puffing out a lazy stream of smoke, and 2 narrow windows facing the dirt path I drove in on. The place looked old but taken care of. No graffiti, no broken boards, no trash around. Just quiet. I pulled in next to a stump that must have served as a kind of makeshift parking spot, got out, stretched, and stood for a while listening to the quiet. It wasn't silent. There was the sound of wind pushing through the trees, the occasional creak of a branch moving, but it was empty in a way you don't feel in the city. There were no planes overhead, no cars in the distance, no barking dogs. It was just nothing. Inside, the cabin was even simpler than I expected. A small wood table with 2 chairs, a futon pushed against one wall, a narrow bed in the corner with a wool blanket folded on top, and a cast iron wood stove near the center. There was a small sink, a pump handle beside it for water, and some open shelving with a few dishes, pots, and pans. No electricity, just candles and a few oil lamps hanging from hooks in the beams. I checked the small bathroom tucked in the back. It had a composting toilet and a bucket shower setup that I knew I'd only use if I absolutely had to. I spent that first evening getting settled, splitting some firewood from the pile stacked under a tarp outside, getting the stove going, and putting my food in a cooler beside the door where it stayed cold. I didn't even open a book that night. I just sat on the porch in a heavy coat, drank a beer, and watched the shadows stretch and bend as the sun went down behind the ridge. I felt relaxed for the first time in months. The first couple days passed without anything worth mentioning. I cooked basic meals, read, wrote a little in an old journal, and went on slow walks through the woods nearby. I kept track of my path, sticking to visible trails or marking trees with broken twigs to find my way back. The trees were tall and thin, close together, and the air had that crisp, dry smell of late fall. I saw a few deer, some squirrels, maybe a fox once, but nothing unusual, just nature doing its thing. But on the 3rd night, something started to feel off. It was late, probably close to midnight, and I just finished a chapter in a book I was reading when I heard a sound outside. Not an animal noise, not the wind, Not a tree creaking, but something more mechanical. It was a dull metallic clink, like someone dropping a wrench onto concrete. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough that it didn't fit the background noise I'd grown used to. I froze, listening. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no voices, no rustling. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped outside onto the porch. The cold hit me immediately. My breath fogged in the beam of the light. I swept it across the trees and down toward the slope where the dirt path curved out of sight. Nothing moved. I stood there a while, then went back in, bolted the door, and went to bed. I told myself it could have been something shifting in the shed behind the cabin or even something falling inside the stovepipe, but it didn't sit right. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check things over. The shed behind the place was locked with a heavy padlock, just like it had been when I arrived. The stovepipe was clean and didn't show any signs of falling debris. I walked down the path a bit, scanning the dirt for tracks or signs that someone had passed through, but I didn't see anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I made sure to shut and lock every door and window. I kept the flashlight and a small hatchet next to the bed. It wasn't that I was scared exactly, but something had shifted in my brain. That sense of peace I'd felt was gone, replaced by a low hum of alertness I couldn't ignore. I lay awake for a long time listening, waiting. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, this time closer. Another metal clink, followed by the unmistakable sound of snow or dirt being disturbed. It sounded like someone dragging something across the ground outside the cabin, maybe 10 feet from the window. I sat up slowly, grabbed the flashlight, and eased myself to the window. I didn't open the curtain fully, just pulled it back enough to peek through. I saw movement, a shape dark, human-sized, moving between the trees just past the edge of the clearing. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette of someone standing half-hidden behind a trunk, facing the cabin. They weren't moving, just standing, watching. I stayed there, not breathing, for I don't know how long. Then the figure slowly stepped back into the woods and vanished. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I debated whether to pack up and leave, but I didn't want to panic. I convinced myself it could have been a hunter, maybe someone who lived further up in the hills. But I'd been told the area was private land, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone else since arriving. Still, I forced myself to believe it was explainable. I spent the rest of the day sharpening the hatchet, double-checking the windows, and making sure the door was secure. I dragged a small dresser in front of the door just in case. I kept the fire low that night and sat in the dark, listening again. Nothing happened for hours. Then, just before dawn, I heard something brush against the back wall of the cabin. A slow, scraping sound, like fingertips or a branch dragging along the wood siding. It moved from the back corner to the side window near the bed. Then it stopped. I waited, heart hammering. Then I saw a hand press against the glass. Just a hand, pale, bare. Fingers splayed slightly. It rested there for a few seconds, then disappeared. That was enough. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I packed everything into the truck. I didn't even eat. I just threw everything into the cab, stomped out the fire, and took one last walk around the cabin. There were footprints near the side window, bare feet in the freezing dirt. No shoes, just soles and toes, pressed into the earth like someone had stood there a long time. I didn't follow them. I just got in and drove. The dirt road felt longer on the way back. Every bend made me expect to see someone in the rearview mirror. Every rustle in the trees made my shoulders tense. I didn't relax until I hit the highway again and saw a gas station in the distance. I reported what I saw to the sheriff's department back in Boulder. They took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. The land was technically outside their jurisdiction, and the cabin owner said no one else should have been up there. I didn't press it. I just wanted to forget it, but I couldn't. Weeks went by. I had nightmares. I started locking my apartment door twice, checking windows 3 times before bed. I stopped going out as much. I kept replaying those nights over and over. The sound, the shape in the trees, the hand on the glass. I ended up getting a therapist. I told him most of the story, though I left out the handprint. I didn't want to sound crazy, He said it was likely I'd been on edge and imagined parts of it. But I know what I saw. The cabin's still listed online. I checked once, months later. Still available. Still remote. Same directions. Same photos. But I won't go back. I won't ever go back. I was 34 that fall, and I remember the exact week I left for the cabin because it was right after I quit my job. I had been working for a small construction management firm in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the hours had started to wear me down. I'd been through a breakup that summer too, and I felt like I needed space. More space than just staying at home and watching TV all day. I wasn't interested in seeing friends or trying to date again. I didn't even want to talk to anyone. I just wanted to be alone and somewhere quiet. A friend of mine named Patrick had a small hunting cabin his family rarely used anymore. It was up near Ely, Minnesota, tucked between long stretches of gravel roads and pine forest. He offered to let me stay there for a while. No charge. Just bring your own supplies, he said, and clean up before you go. Sounded perfect. I didn't ask any questions. It was mid-September, and the weather was already getting cool. The days were short, and the leaves were turning gold and red. I packed up my SUV with a cooler, canned food, some dry stuff like rice and granola, propane for a small camp stove, sleeping gear, a shotgun for safety, and a pile of books I'd been meaning to read for years. I brought a small solar battery and lanterns, but the cabin didn't have power or plumbing, and I knew that going in. I expected to haul water from a nearby lake and heat the place with the wood stove. That was fine with me. I wasn't looking for comfort. It took about 6 hours to drive from St. Paul to Ely, and then another hour to reach the cabin on rough dirt roads that hadn't been maintained in years. I had to go slow, weaving around rocks and big dips in the road. I saw 2 deer on the way in and not much else. No other vehicles, no cabins, no people. When I finally pulled up, it was just past 5 p.m., and the sun was already starting to sink low in the sky. The cabin was small and weathered, with dark green paint peeling off the sides. It had a short set of steps up to a little porch, a tin roof that rattled in the breeze, and a single wooden door with a rusted handle. The place smelled like pine and dry rot, and the woods around it were completely still. No wind, no birds, just a wall of trees in every direction. Inside, it was about what I expected. A single room with a cot, a table, 2 chairs, and a little counter with some open shelves. The wood stove was tucked into a corner, and there was a stack of split logs near the door. A kerosene lamp sat on the table, and a few old pans were hung from nails in the wall. A small attic hatch was above the cot, but I didn't bother looking up there. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked around. It wasn't cozy, but it felt safe. I unpacked and started a fire in the stove right away, took the edge off the cold. Then I boiled water from a jug I brought and made some instant noodles. After that, I sat outside on the porch and watched the light fade through the trees. It got dark fast. Real dark. There was no moon that night and no glow from towns or cars. Just blackness swallowing up the woods. I hadn't felt that kind of dark in years. It made me uneasy at first, but I reminded myself that was the whole point of being there. Alone. Away from noise. The first night was quiet. I slept light, waking every time the stove creaked or an acorn hit the roof. The wind picked up around 3 a.m., and I could hear it moving through the trees like a slow wave. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I boiled coffee and sat on the porch again, wrapped in a blanket. I watched a squirrel run along a branch and vanish. I didn't see another living thing all day. I settled into a rhythm over the next couple of days. Get up, make coffee, walk down to the lake to haul water, then read or go for a short hike. I'd brought a camp saw and hatchet, so I cut more firewood in the afternoons. At night, I cooked rice or soup and went to bed early. The silence was thick but not unpleasant. I started to feel calmer. I didn't think about work. I didn't miss anyone. But on the 5th night, something changed. I had just gotten into my sleeping bag, the stove still putting out a bit of heat, and I was staring up at the ceiling when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, a light crunching sound, like a boot on dry leaves. I froze, came again, closer this time. Then a second sound, slower, almost like dragging. I sat up and held my breath. The fire was low, and the cabin was dim. I waited, listening hard. Then silence. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a bear. Nothing unusual for that area. Still, I got up, unlatched the shotgun, and quietly stepped over to the door. I didn't open it, just stood there listening. A minute passed, then two. Nothing. I climbed back into the sleeping bag, but I kept the shotgun nearby. The next morning, I went out and looked around. There were no tracks, but the ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, and it had rained lightly the day before, so that didn't mean much. I walked a slow circle around the cabin but found nothing strange. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there. That day, I kept closer to the cabin. I chopped wood, read, and watched the woods. I noticed that I wasn't hearing birds anymore. No squirrels. No rustling in the trees. The woods felt dead. That night, it happened again. This time, the sound came from the back of the cabin. Slow footsteps moving through the brush, then stopping, then moving again. I waited, holding the shotgun, sweating under the sleeping bag. I never heard anything retreat, just the footsteps, then nothing. Again, I found no tracks in the morning, but I did see something else. There were scratches on the back wall of the cabin. Not claw marks, long shallow scratches in the paint and wood. They were low to the ground, maybe 2 feet up, and they hadn't been there before. I checked again after breakfast to be sure. The paint was freshly scraped. Not deep, but fresh. I took a photo with my phone. It didn't prove anything, but it was something. That was the first day I seriously considered leaving. I could have packed up and driven out, but part of me felt like I was overreacting. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the scratches had been there and I just missed them. I spent the day tense, looking out the windows, shotgun always nearby. I didn't go to the lake. I stayed close, checking every angle of the tree line. That night, I didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Not footsteps this time. Something brushing against the side of the cabin. Then what sounded like a low thud near the porch. I sat up, my heart pounding. I lit the lantern, kept it low, and waited. I wanted to look out, but I didn't want to open the door. I stayed like that for 2 hours. Then silence. When dawn came, I stepped outside with the shotgun. I walked the perimeter again, and this time I found something new. A rope, a short length of frayed rope, maybe 2 feet long, lying near the steps. It hadn't been there before. It was old and damp, stained dark at one end. I picked it up, looked around, and felt a cold weight in my gut. I didn't know what it meant, but it wasn't mine and it wasn't natural. I packed everything that morning. I had enough. I got the stove cold, doused the ashes, and loaded the SUV. The whole time I felt watched. I kept the shotgun next to me. Just as I was pulling away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw something at the tree line. It moved slightly, a figure or maybe just a trick of light. I didn't stop to find out. I drove. The road out was slower than I remembered. I hit a deep rut and nearly blew a tire, but I made it to the highway by afternoon. I drove all the way back to St. Paul that night. I didn't even stop for food. When I got home, I unpacked, took a hot shower, and locked every door and window. For days I kept thinking about that rope, about the scratches, about the sounds. I didn't tell anyone, not even Patrick. I couldn't explain it. There were no ghosts, no monsters, just something or someone out there, watching, waiting. 2 weeks later, I went through the photos on my phone and found the one of the back wall. I zoomed in on the scratches just to look again. And that's when I saw something I missed the first time. There was a small mark next to the scratches, almost like a symbol. 3 short lines stacked over a longer one, like tally marks. I didn't know what it meant, but it wasn't natural. Someone had been there. I deleted the photo. I haven't been back to the woods since. I still think about that week sometimes, especially at night. Not because I saw something supernatural, but because I didn't. Whatever was out there was real, and that makes it worse. It wasn't a ghost. It was a person, and they knew I was alone. I was 38 when I decided to take a break from everything. It was the summer of 2019, and my job in Boise had been wearing me down. I was working as a mechanic, and every day felt like the one before. Wrench in hand, grease under my nails, shoulders stiff by noon. It had been over 8 years since I took a real vacation, and I was starting to feel it deep in my chest. Tight, constant pressure that wouldn't let up. I needed to get out, away from machines, phones, noise, and even people. I didn't want to talk to anyone, and I didn't want anyone to talk to me. I just wanted quiet. I found the cabin through an old forum post. Some guy had posted a picture of a place he stayed up north in Montana, about 20 miles from a tiny town called Libby. He said the spot was remote, peaceful, no cell signal, and near a little lake. I messaged him privately, asked if the place was still around. He gave me a number for a local guy who handled rentals for the property. It wasn't listed anywhere official, just a cash deal, $300 for the week. Sounded perfect. I drove up on a Saturday. It was a little over 6 hours from Boise to Libby, but once I passed through town, the roads turned to gravel, then dirt. I followed the directions I was given. Turn left at the burned-down barn, drive another 5 miles, look for the old windmill. It felt like something out of an old western. I finally found the place just after 4 p.m. The cabin sat at the end of a long, rutted path, surrounded by dense trees on all sides except the rear, where it looked out over a calm little lake maybe 100 yards wide. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, just a single-story wooden structure with a small porch and a tin roof. It had one room with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and some basic shelves. There was no electricity, no running water. The bathroom was an outhouse a few yards away. A few tools hung on nails outside the cabin wall. An old axe, a hammer, a handsaw. A rusted metal bucket sat beneath the hand pump out front, which still worked surprisingly well. I filled up a jug with water and took a few swigs. It was cold and tasted fine. By the time I unloaded my gear and got settled, the sun was starting to dip. I had packed enough canned food for the week, plus a propane stove and a small cooler. I heated up a can of chili and sat on the porch, eating straight from the tin with a plastic spoon, watching the still water of the lake and listening to the wind move through the trees. I felt good, really good. The first night was quiet. I left the windows open and let the breeze roll through. I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the woods, branches creaking, the occasional splash from the lake, an owl in the distance. No cars, no voices, no hum of city lights, just raw, open silence. I spent the next 2 days doing almost nothing. I took long walks around the lake. There wasn't a trail, just soft forest floor and occasional game paths. I brought a folding chair down to the water and spent hours just sitting there, watching dragonflies and the slow ripples that spread out when a fish jumped. I chopped wood with the axe even though I didn't need to. I liked the rhythm of it. I was alone and it felt right. It was Tuesday when things started to feel off. That morning I woke up early, just before dawn. The air was colder than usual, and there was a weird stillness to everything. I got dressed, made some instant coffee, and sat on the porch wrapped in a flannel blanket. I noticed something strange near the treeline across the lake. Something white, something that didn't look like it belonged. I squinted and stood up, walking a few feet closer. It looked like fabric. A shirt, maybe, or a tarp. I couldn't tell from that distance, and I didn't have binoculars. I figured it was trash. Maybe someone had camped on the other side and left something behind. It didn't seem important. But later that afternoon, when I was walking the edge of the lake again, I tried to cross over to that side. The terrain was rough. Lots of fallen trees, thick brush, muddy spots near the water. It took me almost an hour to get to the place I thought I'd seen the fabric from. But when I got there, nothing. No shirt, no tarp, no trash. I walked around for a while, confused. Maybe I got the wrong spot, or maybe I imagined it. Still, the woods felt strange, like they were watching me. I don't usually get paranoid in nature, but something about that side of the lake made my skin crawl. I headed back before the light faded. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept waking up, hearing small sounds outside, twigs snapping, the dry crunch of footsteps. I told myself it was animals. There were signs of deer everywhere, probably raccoons too, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Wednesday morning, I found tracks. Not deer tracks, not animal tracks, footprints, bare feet in the dirt behind the outhouse. The prints were small, narrow, with long toes. Too small for an adult man, but not a child either. Maybe a woman? I don't know. They led from the treeline to the back of the cabin, then circled around to the porch. Then they just stopped. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach turning. I walked the area slowly, checking the brush, the trees, even climbed onto the porch roof to see if maybe someone had tried to hide up there. Nothing. I didn't hear anything unusual the night before, but it's not like the cabin was secure. The door didn't lock properly, it just had a simple latch. I decided I'd sleep with the axe that night, just in case. That evening, I built a small fire pit near the lake and sat there late into the night, trying to stay calm. I watched the trees. I thought about driving back to town, but the road out was rough and I didn't want to drive in the dark. I told myself if anything else happened, I'd leave first thing in the morning. I went back inside just after midnight. I checked all the windows and latched the door, then laid down with the axe beside me. I didn't fall asleep right away. I just listened. At around 2:30 in the morning, I heard the porch creak. I held my breath. The sound was faint, but it was definitely the wooden boards of the porch. Then, slowly, the sound of the latch moving. It didn't open. I had placed a piece of firewood against the inside of the door before going to bed. If someone tried to push it open, it would get jammed. I sat up and quietly pulled on my boots. I moved slowly to the window, trying not to make a sound. The moonlight was weak, but I could just barely see the outline of a figure standing on the porch. Not moving, just standing there. I couldn't see details, just the shape. I backed away from the window. My hands were sweating, heart thudding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stood there in the dark, holding the axe, waiting. After about 2 minutes, the shape turned and walked away. I heard the boards creak again, then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun started coming up, I grabbed my gear, threw everything in the back of the truck, and left. I drove straight to Libby. Didn't even stop for gas until I hit Kalispell. I kept checking my mirrors the whole way, half expecting to see someone following me. But I didn't. Back in Boise, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told myself it was probably a squatter, maybe someone living rough in the woods, maybe someone mentally ill. Still, I couldn't shake the image of those prints behind the cabin. The fact that they circled the place, then disappeared. Or the way the person stood there in complete silence for minutes before walking off. I reported it to the sheriff's office in Lincoln County about a week later. Told them I thought someone might be living out there, maybe breaking into cabins. The deputy I talked to didn't seem surprised. He said they occasionally get reports like that. People living off-grid, sometimes not right in the head. He took down the information but didn't promise much. I never went back. I still have the photos I took, the lake, the fire pit, the view from the porch. They look peaceful, quiet, but every time I look at them now, I get that same cold feeling in my gut. Whoever that was, they weren't just passing through. They were watching, and I still don't know how long they'd been there before I noticed, or how close they got while I was sleeping. But I do know one thing, I'll never go to a place like that alone again. Not ever. It was late October 1998 when I finally got to the cabin. I had been waiting months to get away from the city and the noise, and when my boss told me I could take a week off, I jumped on the chance. I was 27 then, and I wanted a break, a real break. No phones, no people, just me in the woods. The cabin belonged to my uncle, a man I barely knew, who owned a small place deep in the woods outside a town called Pine Hollow, somewhere in northern Vermont. The kind of town where the trees were tall, the air was cold, and everyone knew everyone else. The drive was long and quiet, especially as the city streets faded behind me, replaced by winding roads lined with thick trees, their leaves already turning red and gold. The sky was gray and low, and the air smelled like wet earth and old pine. I parked the car near a rough dirt road and started walking, my bag slung over my shoulder. The cabin was about a mile in from the road, hidden among the trees. When I reached it, the cabin looked exactly how I expected. Small, made of old logs with chipping brown paint, a tin roof, and a porch with 2 creaky chairs. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, and the door was cracked open like it was waiting for me. The windows were dusty but clear enough to see the simple furniture inside. A wooden table, a few chairs, a couch that looked like it had seen better days, and a small kitchen area. There was no electricity, just a small propane stove and some oil lamps. The silence hit me immediately. It wasn't peaceful or calm. Exactly. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I could hear the wind moving through the trees and the distant caw of crows. No cars, no planes, no voices. I felt a shiver, but it wasn't cold yet. I settled in quickly. I unpacked the few things I brought. A couple of books, some canned food, bottled water, and a small camping stove my uncle had left behind. The cabin smelled of old wood and something faintly musty, like it hadn't been opened for a while. I opened a window to let some fresh air in and went outside to gather some firewood. The ground was damp, covered with a thick layer of fallen leaves and twigs. I stacked the wood carefully near the fireplace and started a fire with matches and dry kindling. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I sat near the fire with a cup of coffee and looked out the window. The woods pressed close to the cabin, thick and dark. The trees bare in some places, still holding their leaves in others. The wind picked up, and the branches scraped against each other like fingers. That night, I went to bed early, tired from the drive and the fresh air. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind moved through the trees, and somewhere outside, an animal called out. A deep, long howl that made my stomach twist. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the strange noises of the forest. The next day was clear but cold. I went for a walk in the woods, following a faint trail my uncle had marked on a map he left me. The trees towered over me, and the sunlight barely touched the ground through the thick branches. I moved slowly, listening to the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional snap of a twig. After a couple of hours, I returned to the cabin, feeling tired but good. I prepared a simple lunch, heating canned soup on the stove. I thought about how long it had been since I'd had this kind of quiet. No interruptions, no emails, no phones ringing. As the afternoon turned to evening, the wind grew stronger. The sky darkened with heavy clouds, and a steady rain began to fall, tapping on the roof and windows. I lit all the lamps in the cabin, their soft glow filling the small space. The storm made the woods outside look even darker and more tangled. That night, something changed. I couldn't say exactly what, but the silence felt different, more intense. I kept hearing faint sounds, scratches, knocks, something moving just outside the cabin. I got up to check the windows and doors. They were all locked tight. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the wind or animals looking for shelter, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing toward the forest, half expecting to see a shadow moving just past the tree line. My heart beat faster, but I stayed quiet, hoping it would pass. The next morning, the storm had stopped. The sky was a pale blue, and the ground was soaked. I opened the door to let some air in, stepping outside to stretch. The forest looked peaceful again, with wet leaves shining in the soft sunlight. But then I noticed something odd. Near the edge of the clearing, a set of footprints pressed into the soft earth. They were big, too big to be a deer or small animal. I knelt down and looked closer. The prints were deep, with a clear outline of boots, and they led from the woods right up to the cabin's porch. My skin prickled. I hadn't heard anyone come by. No cars, no voices, no signs of people nearby. The footprints stopped right at the porch and didn't continue anywhere else. I checked all the doors and windows again, and everything was as I had left it. For the rest of the day, I stayed close to the cabin, stacking more firewood, fixing a small leak in the roof, and cooking a hot meal. I kept checking the windows, feeling uneasy but telling myself maybe it was just a hunter or someone passing through the woods. That night, I barely slept. The wind was back, blowing hard against the cabin, and I kept hearing noises outside. Twigs breaking, rustling leaves, footsteps maybe. I stayed awake with a knife by my side, staring out the window, waiting. In the early morning hours, I heard something more distinct. A scraping noise, like someone dragging something heavy near the back of the cabin. I didn't move. I just held my breath, listening. When the first light of dawn came through the window, the noises stopped. I went outside carefully, flashlight in hand. Near the back of the cabin, the ground was disturbed, as if someone had dug or moved dirt. There were broken branches and a pile of rocks shifted to the side. Nothing else, no sign of who or what made the mess. I felt my stomach tighten. Something wasn't right. I packed some things quickly, but before I could leave, I saw it. An old, rusted can tied to a tree branch near the trail. It was swinging gently in the morning breeze. Inside was a note, folded and soaked by the rain. I unfolded it carefully. The writing was shaky, almost unreadable in parts. It said, "You shouldn't be here. Leave before it's too late." I looked around, heart pounding. The woods were quiet. No one else was near, but I didn't feel safe anymore. I decided I would leave that day. I wanted to get back to the city, to people, to lights and noise and safety. But as I packed, I kept hearing small sounds, footsteps just beyond the trees, snapping twigs, a rustling that never stopped. I loaded the car, keeping my eyes on the forest. When I started the engine, the noise seemed to fade. I didn't wait for anything else. I pulled onto the dirt road and drove fast, the cabin shrinking behind me until it was swallowed by the trees. On the way back, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing where the cabin was, watching me leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. Back in the city, the noise and crowds felt overwhelming, but I was safe. I never went back to that cabin. I never told anyone about the note or the footprints or the strange feeling of being watched. It was a place that held a quiet kind of fear, not from ghosts or monsters, but from the real, simple truth that sometimes people don't want you there. And sometimes that warning is enough. I didn't expect the trip to be anything special. It was late fall of 1998, and I was 29, tired of the city noise and the endless rush of everyday life. I needed to get away, to find a place where silence and nature could wash away the stress. I booked a small cabin in the mountains near Asheville, North Carolina. The cabin was isolated, miles from the nearest town. The owner promised peace and quiet, no distractions. Exactly what I wanted. The drive up was long but beautiful. The trees were mostly bare, the last leaves clinging on in shades of brown and red. I passed small farms, winding roads, and patches of fog that hovered low over the fields. The air was crisp, cold enough to make me wish I'd brought heavier clothes. My car's heater was struggling, but it was bearable. I arrived late afternoon. The sun was already dipping behind the ridges. The cabin was just as the listing showed, small, wooden, with a stone chimney and a porch that wrapped around the front. It sat at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by dense woods on three sides. I felt a chill not from the cold but from the sudden silence. No cars, no people, just wind rustling through the dry leaves and distant bird calls. I parked and unloaded my bag. Inside, the cabin smelled like pine and old wood. It was dusty but clean, with a simple kitchen, a living room with a couch and a fireplace, and a small bedroom. There was no phone or internet, no TV, which was exactly what I wanted. Just me and the wilderness. I started a fire in the fireplace and boiled water on the old stove. I had packed some canned soup, bread, and coffee. As the room warmed, I sat back and looked out the window. The sky had turned a deep blue with the first stars appearing. I was alone, truly alone, for the first time in a long while. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The first night passed quietly. I woke a few times to strange sounds. Twigs snapping outside, the wind pushing against the cabin walls. Nothing unusual for a place like this. I told myself to relax. I was here to unwind, not to worry about the forest. The next day, I decided to explore. I found a trailhead a few hundred feet from the cabin. The path was narrow and covered with leaves. I walked for miles, watching the trees, the occasional squirrel darting in the underbrush, and the slow climb of the sun overhead. The quiet was comforting. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the mud just outside the porch steps. They looked fresh. I frowned. No one was supposed to be nearby. The owner had said the cabin was far from any neighbors or hunters. I checked my phone. No signal. Great. I brushed off the feeling of unease and told myself maybe it was a deer or some animal. That evening, while making dinner, I heard a faint noise outside. It was like footsteps crunching leaves. I stopped and listened. The sounds stopped. I told myself I was imagining things. The woods could play tricks on your mind, especially when you're alone. I locked the door and double-checked the windows before bed. Still, sleep was restless. On the third day, I woke early and decided to check the perimeter of the property. I carried my backpack and a hunting knife I had brought for safety. The woods were dense, the trees tall and close. I walked along the edge of the clearing, paying close attention to the ground. More footprints. These ones were different, larger, and they went deeper into the woods. They looked human. My stomach tightened. I turned back to the cabin quickly, the hairs on my neck standing up. When I reached the porch, I noticed the door latch was loose, hanging slightly off its hook. I never left it like that. Inside, everything was untouched. No signs of entry. Maybe the latch was old and slipped? I hoped so. That night, I stayed up late, the fire burning low. I kept the knife close just in case. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, heart pounding. The sounds stopped abruptly, then silence. The next morning, I found a small pile of broken twigs and leaves on the porch. Someone had been there, watching, waiting. I was angry and scared. I considered leaving immediately, but the nearest town was a 2-hour drive down narrow, winding roads I wasn't familiar with. Besides, I had promised myself to stay 3 days. I told myself I'd call the owner when I got back. On the 4th day, I packed a bag with essentials and prepared to leave first thing in the morning. But something made me stay awake that night, alert and tense. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps returned, louder this time. I could hear breathing now, ragged and heavy, just outside the window. I grabbed the knife and moved silently to the door. I unlocked it quietly, cracked it open, and shined my flashlight out. Nothing. No one. Just the dark woods, swaying trees, and shadows. Suddenly, a figure darted behind the nearest tree, too fast to see clearly. My heart leapt. I wanted to scream or run, but I stayed frozen. I bolted the door, locked it, and stayed awake until dawn. When daylight came, I stepped outside cautiously. I looked for any signs of the figure. The footprints led away into the woods and stopped abruptly near a fallen log. I followed, my breathing shallow. Nearby, I found a small campsite, abandoned but fresh. A makeshift shelter of branches and leaves, a burnt-out fire pit, and empty food wrappers. Someone had been living in these woods, watching the cabin. The reality hit me hard. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been hiding near my cabin the whole time. I checked the time. I needed to get out. I packed quickly and left without looking back. On the drive back, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the town, I went straight to the police. They took my statement but said they couldn't do much without proof or a suspect. I felt uneasy but relieved to be around people again. Weeks later, I got a call from the cabin owner. He told me he had found evidence of squatters in the cabin, signs of forced entry in the past, stolen supplies, and strange footprints. He apologized for not telling me earlier. Apparently, the previous renters had complained about noises and missing items but never reported it. I never went back. The experience left a mark on me. I realized that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but other people. The woods hide all sorts of dangers, and not all of them are easy to see or understand. Now, I stick to safer places, and when I'm alone, I'm more aware of the real risks. The silence of nature can be a comfort, but it can also hide the quiet footsteps of someone watching, waiting for the right moment. It was the fall of 2011 when I decided to take a break from everything. I had been working long hours in a small town in northern Michigan, doing odd jobs and barely seeing the sun through the windows of cheap apartments. The stress was getting to me. I wanted something quiet, something away from people and noise, something to clear my head. I found a small cabin to rent near a remote lake called Lost Pine Lake, deep in the forested hills about 45 miles north of Traverse City. The place wasn't fancy, but it was isolated, and that's exactly what I wanted. The cabin was old, built in the late 70s or early 80s, made from rough pine logs that had darkened with time and weather. It sat on a small clearing about 100 yards from the lake shore, surrounded by thick woods with towering spruce and maple trees. The area was known for its natural beauty, but also for how few people came out that far. A thin gravel road led in from the main highway, but it wasn't maintained well. When I got there in mid-October, the first frost had just settled over the ground, and the leaves had started turning colors: reds, yellows, and orange. It was the kind of place you'd see in postcards or travel magazines. But it was also cold and silent, with a feeling like the forest was watching. The cabin itself was small: one main room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove for heat, and a tiny bedroom in the back. The furniture was sparse and worn: a lumpy couch, a wooden dining table with 4 mismatched chairs, and a bed with a thin mattress. The windows were small, with heavy curtains I found already hanging there. There was no electricity, no running water except from a nearby well, and no phone signal. Cell phones barely worked, and the closest neighbors were miles away. It was perfect for what I wanted. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my time chopping wood for the stove, exploring the shoreline of the lake, and hiking short trails through the forest. The air was crisp and fresh, filled with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. At night, the silence was almost complete, except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I was alone, and it felt good. I had brought some books, canned food, a small generator, and a few essentials. I liked the simplicity of the cabin, the chance to be disconnected from everything. No emails, no calls, no TV. Just me and the woods. But as the days passed, I started to notice small things that unsettled me. At first, it was subtle. A faint smell, like something burning, but I couldn't find where it came from. Some small branches and leaves seemed disturbed around the cabin, as if someone or something had walked close by during the night. The trail to the lake showed footprints that didn't look like mine, small and uneven, barely visible but there. I told myself it was probably animals or the wind. On the 4th night, things got worse. I was sitting by the wood stove, reading a book, when I heard a faint crunching noise outside. It was late, maybe 11 p.m., and the moon was just a thin crescent behind thick clouds. The sound was soft, like someone stepping carefully through dry leaves and broken twigs. I froze and listened. The noise stopped, then started again a little farther from the cabin, then stopped again. My heart was pounding. I grabbed a flashlight and stood up, shining the beam out the window, but saw nothing but dark trees and shadows. The next morning, I found more footprints in the dirt around the cabin, this time bigger and deeper, like from heavy boots. I hadn't seen any other cars come down the gravel road. I was sure I was alone here. That day, I went into the woods further than before, trying to find where the footprints might have come from. The forest was thick, with fallen leaves making the ground soft. I walked for an hour but found nothing unusual. When I came back, the sun was already low, and the temperature was dropping quickly. That evening, I locked all the doors and windows, stacked extra wood near the stove, and prepared myself for a cold night. I kept the flashlight close and my small hunting knife on the table. The crunching noises returned around midnight, this time closer and more frequent, like someone pacing just outside the cabin walls. I stayed awake as long as I could, listening and watching, but I didn't see anyone. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed some things, planning to leave at first light, but when I opened the door, I stopped. The gravel road was blocked by a fallen tree. Not just a small branch, but a large oak tree, freshly downed, with roots pulled out of the earth. It had landed across the road in a way that no car could get past. The trunk was thick and heavy. I had no chainsaw or tools to move it. I cursed under my breath. No cell signal, no neighbors, and now this. I realized I was trapped. The days that followed were tense. I tried to call for help several times but got nothing. I made several attempts to clear smaller branches and rocks off the road, but the big tree was impossible to move alone. I was running low on food and fuel for the generator. I rationed what I had carefully. At night, the noises outside the cabin grew louder and more persistent. The crunching of footsteps, snapping twigs, soft thuds against the walls, sometimes heavy breathing. I never saw anyone, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I slept poorly, waking often to check my knife and flashlight. One morning, I woke up to find the cabin door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. Inside, some of my canned food was moved, and the floor showed fresh muddy footprints. My heart sank. I started to realize this wasn't random. Someone was out there watching me, trying to intimidate me. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin doors and windows with whatever I could find. Broken chair legs, a metal rod from the stovepipe, heavy furniture pushed against the door. I hid the key to the cabin in a secret place just in case. I found an old hunting rifle in the cabin's small closet, rusty but still functional. I cleaned it as best I could and kept it with me at all times. I didn't tell myself it was dangerous. I tried to stay calm, rational. Maybe a local hunter or someone camping nearby had noticed me and was messing around. Maybe it was teenagers playing pranks. But the fear was growing every day. On the 7th night, the worst happened. I was lying in bed when I heard loud banging on the front door. Hard, fast, like someone was trying to break it down. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the rifle and aimed through the small window. The door shook again, and I heard a voice shouting, but the wind carried it away, and I couldn't make out the words. I stayed still and quiet, heart racing. After a few minutes, the banging stopped. The door was cracked but still standing. In the morning, I found deep scratches on the door frame and fresh blood drops on the steps. It looked like someone was hurt, but no footprints led away. I realized this wasn't a prank or a random person. This was someone desperate, dangerous, maybe unstable. I couldn't wait anymore. I packed my bags in a hurry, planning to sneak out at first light. I waited through the night, keeping the rifle close, watching every shadow. When dawn finally broke, I slipped outside quietly. The fallen tree was still there. I had to find another way out. I decided to walk through the forest, hoping to reach the highway on foot. The map I had showed a faint trail that led north, about 3 miles away. It would be rough, but I didn't see another choice. I left the cabin behind, moving quickly but carefully. The forest was thick, branches scratching at my jacket, the ground slippery with wet leaves. I kept the rifle ready. Hours passed. My legs were sore, and my breath came fast. The trail was faint but visible if I paid close attention. The sun was warm on my face, and I could hear birds singing in the distance. Suddenly, I heard a rustle behind me. I stopped, heart pounding. I turned slowly and saw a figure moving among the trees, staying just out of clear view. It was the same person from before, no doubt. I started walking faster, trying to lose them, but the figure matched my pace. Panic surged through me. I broke into a run, stumbling over roots and rocks. The figure followed, gaining ground. I reached a small creek and crossed it quickly, hoping it would slow whoever was chasing me. I climbed a steep hill and looked around. Far below, I saw a small clearing with a gravel road shining in the morning sun. I sprinted toward it, screaming for help. The figure stopped at the tree line and watched me. When I reached the road, I saw a car parked 100 yards away, and a man sitting inside, looking at his phone. I ran toward the car and pounded on the window. He looked up, startled. I didn't stop running until I was inside his vehicle, locking the doors behind me. I told him that I was trapped in the cabin by someone who was trying to hurt me. He nodded, reached for his phone, and called the sheriff. Within an hour, A small police team arrived with chainsaws to clear the fallen tree and officers to search the area. They found footprints around the cabin, and eventually they caught the man, a drifter known in the area for breaking into cabins and robbing or threatening people. He had been living rough in the woods. I was 38 that year, and I had just come off a rough stretch of nonstop work. I'd been grinding through construction contracts for almost 9 months straight, trying to keep ahead of bills after the split with my ex. She took the house, and I didn't fight her on it. I just needed to keep moving, keep earning. But by the time September came around, my back hurt all the time, and my hands were stiff in the mornings. I was burned out. My buddy Jeff had told me about this place in northern Idaho, a cabin near Lake Pend-Oreille, way off the beaten path, past Sandpoint. He'd stayed there a couple of years earlier, said it was peaceful, dead quiet, surrounded by nothing but trees. That's exactly what I needed. No people, no phones, no traffic, just trees, water, and time to sit still for once. The place was old, owned by some guy named Arnold who lived out in Washington and rented it for dirt cheap as long as you didn't mind a little dust and the occasional squirrel getting into the attic. I didn't. I packed up my gear, loaded some canned food, a couple coolers with sandwich meat and water, and headed out. I didn't even tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I was taking a break for a couple weeks. The drive from Spokane took about 3.5 hours. The roads got thinner the farther north I went, and by the time I turned off onto the narrow dirt path Arnold had marked in the instructions, I was already out of cell service. The air smelled like pine and wet dirt. I followed the road slowly, avoiding potholes and thick roots that had pushed up through the packed earth. It felt like I was going nowhere for the longest time, just endless forest and the crunch of gravel under the tires. Eventually, I reached the clearing. The cabin sat in a small patch of grass, surrounded by tall pines and birch trees, their leaves already starting to turn yellow. It wasn't big, just a single-story structure with a wide porch out front and a tin chimney poking out the top. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in a while, which was fine by me. I didn't need fancy, just quiet. I parked a few feet away, grabbed my bag, and walked up the creaking porch steps. The key was under a rusted coffee can, just like Arnold had said. Inside, the place smelled musty, but not bad. Just that old wood smell you get from places that sit empty too long. There were 2 rooms, a main living area with a small wood stove, a kitchen counter, and a worn couch, and a back room with a bed and a single window looking out into the trees. I spent the first couple hours airing the place out and getting set up. The windows opened, but they were stiff and I had to force a few. There was no electricity, just some oil lamps and a pile of chopped wood stacked next to the stove. I checked the cabinets. A few mice had gotten into them, but otherwise it was clean. I dumped my food into a cooler in the shade outside and unpacked my clothes. That night, I lit the stove and sat on the porch in a camping chair with a flashlight and a book, listening to the wind and the soft creak of the trees around me. It was perfect. The first few days were the best sleep I'd had in years. I woke up to birds instead of trucks or sirens. I spent mornings hiking around the lake, fishing off the rocks, or just lying in the grass doing nothing. My back started to loosen up, and the constant noise in my head began to quiet down. I didn't keep track of the days. I didn't care. Then, around the 5th or 6th night, things started to feel off. I remember waking up suddenly just after midnight. The room was dark except for the soft red glow from the stove in the other room. I didn't know why I woke up at first. There wasn't a sound. No wind. No animals. Just dead silence. That kind of silence you don't get in the city. I lay still, breathing slow, trying to figure out what had disturbed me. It wasn't a nightmare. I hadn't been dreaming. It was like my body knew something I didn't. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and walked out into the main room. The fire had burned down low. I added a couple logs and checked the front door. It was locked. The windows were all shut. Nothing looked moved, but the feeling didn't go away. It sat in my chest like pressure, like when a storm's about to hit and the air gets heavy. I sat on the couch for a while, trying to shake it off. Eventually, I went back to bed, but it took a long time to fall asleep. The next day, I went farther into the woods than I had before. There was an old logging trail that cut east from the lake, and I followed it a couple miles in. The trees were thicker out there. I didn't see any animals, not even birds, just quiet, and that wasn't normal. At one point, I stopped to tie my boot, and I could swear I heard something snap, like a branch underfoot, maybe 30 or 40 feet into the trees. I stood still, listening, but nothing followed. I chalked it up to nerves and kept walking. When I got back to the cabin late that afternoon, I noticed something odd. The door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I always double-checked, especially out here. Nothing was missing inside, but one of the oil lamps was on the floor. Not broken, just lying there sideways. I didn't remember leaving it like that. Again, I tried to tell myself I had made a mistake. Maybe I was tired or distracted. But that old feeling came back, that pressure, that quiet, like the trees were holding their breath. I started sleeping with the hatchet next to the bed after that, just in case. I told myself it was probably just an animal. Maybe a raccoon had figured out the door latch, though that didn't make much sense. I even set up a small string tied to the door handle with a spoon on it, so if anything opened it, I'd hear it fall. 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of the spoon hitting the floor. I froze. My eyes were wide open before I even knew I was awake. There was no wind, no storm, just the soft clatter of the metal spoon on wood. Then nothing. I didn't move right away. I just lay there, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my arms. After maybe 30 seconds, I sat up and grabbed the flashlight. I clicked it on and opened the bedroom door slowly. The main room was empty. The door was cracked open about 3 inches. The spoon lay on the floor right where I had expected, but nothing else was touched. The lamp still sat on the table. The fire had burned low again. I stepped outside into the cold, aiming the flashlight into the trees. Nothing, just endless black trunks and darkness. I turned in a slow circle, listening, but all I heard was my own breathing. I shut the door, locked it again, and pushed the couch in front of it. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I checked for tracks. The dirt outside the porch was packed hard, but I thought I saw something near the edge of the trees. It wasn't clear, just a soft indent like a boot print, but it didn't have enough detail to be sure. I told myself it could have been mine from before, but I wasn't convinced. I didn't go hiking that day. I spent it sitting on the porch, watching the tree line. The following night, it happened again. This time, I didn't hear the spoon fall. I just woke up, same as before, feeling that weight in the air. I walked out, and the door was open again, wider this time, maybe 6 inches. The couch had been nudged slightly, not pushed aside, but moved, just enough to let the door open a crack. The fire had been out for hours. I took the flashlight and stepped outside barefoot, staying on the porch. I didn't go more than 2 steps. I scanned the trees. I was shaking. Every sound felt louder, sharper. I was breathing too fast. Then I saw something, movement, about 20 feet out. Not an animal. Not a bear or deer. Person. They were standing between 2 trees, barely visible, but there. Not moving. No flashlight. No gear. Just a dark outline standing still, watching me. I didn't speak. I just backed into the cabin, slammed the door, and locked it. I pushed the couch back in place and dragged the table over too. I didn't sleep. I sat with the hatchet in my lap until the sun came up. As soon as it was light, I packed everything. I shoved my gear into the bag, left the food, didn't care. I didn't even check the back room. I just got out. The drive back felt like a dream. Every bump in the road made me jump. I didn't stop until I hit Sandpoint. I sat in a gas station parking lot for half an hour, just breathing. Then I got coffee and drove the rest of the way back to Spokane. When I got home, I locked every window, every door, and didn't sleep for 2 days. I don't know who it was. I'll never know. And that's the worst part. They didn't steal anything. They didn't try to talk or break in loudly. They just stood there, came into the cabin when I was asleep, watched, listened, maybe more. I told myself I'd report it, but what could I say? I didn't have a name, no photo, no evidence, just a feeling, a sound, a door slowly opening, a shadow in the trees. I never went back. I never will. And I always lock every door now, twice. I rented the cabin to get away from everything for a while. It was late September 2021. I was 34, living in Reno, Nevada, and things weren't going great for me back then. Work was getting harder, not because it was demanding, but because it was boring. I was burned out. Nothing really felt exciting anymore. I was single, no kids, and most weekends just blurred into each other. My routine was making me feel like I was just drifting. I needed a break. Something simple, quiet, and far away from screens, notifications, and emails. So I took a week off work and booked a cabin up in the Sierra Nevada, not too far from Susanville, California. I found it through a smaller vacation rental site. The place looked decent. Small, old, but clean. Off-grid, but not too deep into the wild. The listing said there was solar power, a wood stove, and a nearby stream. That sounded like enough. Took me just under 3 hours to drive there. The last 30 minutes were on a narrow dirt road that weaved through pine trees and patches of yellowing grass. It was dry that season, unusually so. Everything felt dusty, even the air. The farther I drove, the fewer signs of people I saw. No other cabins, no fences, no parked trucks. Just trees and uneven land. I liked it. It made me feel like I'd really left the city behind. The cabin was tucked into a clearing about 100 yards off the road. You could barely see it through the trees until you were right in front of it. It was a one-room building with a small front porch, a sloped metal roof, and logs stacked neatly under a window. The place looked old but cared for. The front door creaked when I opened it, and inside it smelled like pine and dust. There was one big window on the back wall, a small bed in the corner, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and shelves with mismatched dishes. In the far corner, there was a little bathroom with a composting toilet and a small sink with a pump handle. I unloaded my stuff and walked around a bit, checking the place out. There were a few walking trails leading off into the woods. I found the stream about 5 minutes downhill, a thin ribbon of cold water with smooth stones and fallen branches. It felt nice to just stand there and listen to it. Nothing else around but wind and the distant sound of birds. That first night, I made a fire in the wood stove. It took me a while to get it going, mostly because I don't do that kind of thing often, but eventually it caught and started to warm the room. I cooked a simple dinner from what I brought with me, cans mostly, and read until it got dark. I didn't bring a laptop, just a book and a flashlight. When I finally lay down, it was so quiet it took me a while to fall asleep. I kept listening for sounds, branches, animals, maybe wind through the trees. It wasn't spooky, not yet, just different. The next morning, I woke up to the cold. The fire had gone out, and the inside of the cabin felt like a refrigerator. I pulled on a hoodie and made coffee with the small propane stove that came with the cabin. Tasted better than usual. I brought my mug outside and sat on the porch for a while, staring at nothing in particular. It was peaceful. That was what I came for. Later that day, I hiked around a bit. The trails weren't marked, but they were easy to follow. I took my phone just for the compass and GPS, though I didn't have any service out there. I followed the stream for a while, then cut uphill and found a rocky ledge with a view of the valley. Everything looked dry and quiet. I sat up there until the sun started to dip. It felt like the kind of thing people talk about when they say they need to reconnect with nature. I got back to the cabin just before dark, made another simple dinner, and built another fire. That night, the woods felt different. I couldn't explain it. The air felt heavier somehow. I kept the fire going longer than I needed to, and even though I was tired, I had trouble settling down. There were more sounds outside. Cracks, scuffles, short bursts of wind, but nothing I hadn't heard the night before. Still, it felt like something was close. Not watching, just there. I don't really know how else to put it. It didn't scare me exactly. It just kept me on edge. I finally slept, but not well. I woke up a few times. Once, I thought I heard something scraping near the wall outside the bed. When I checked in the morning, I didn't see anything. No footprints, no scratches. Probably just a raccoon or squirrel. On the third day, I noticed something that bothered me more. A About 100 yards west of the cabin, I found a makeshift fire pit that didn't look like it belonged there. It was shallow, with a ring of half-burned logs and some dark ash. It wasn't part of the cabin setup. This was clearly built by someone else. There were no fresh embers, but it wasn't old either. Couple days at most. Near the pit, I found a crumpled beer can and a torn-up glove. I didn't like that. The whole point of this trip was to be alone. I didn't want to deal with other people, especially not strangers wandering around the woods. I went back to the cabin and checked the door and windows, just in case. Everything still worked fine. I wasn't scared, but I was more alert now. That night, I didn't sleep much at all. Every sound felt louder, and I kept imagining someone moving through the trees. I kept the flashlight next to me and woke up multiple times to check the window. I never saw anyone. On the fourth day, things got worse. I went on a short hike after breakfast, following the same trail I'd taken before. When I came back, the front door to the cabin was slightly open, just a few inches. I was sure I'd closed it. I didn't lock it. The door didn't have a real lock, just a sliding bolt on the inside, but I knew I had shut it. Inside, nothing looked disturbed. My stuff was still there. The bag was zipped, food untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I decided to move the small dresser in front of the door when I went to bed that night. It wasn't heavy, but it would make enough noise if someone tried to open it. I didn't sleep deeply. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard something step on the porch. Just one heavy step, then silence. I waited, holding my breath, listening. Nothing else. I stayed awake until the sky started to turn gray. When I finally got up, I opened the door and looked around. No tracks, but the air smelled faintly like smoke, and I didn't have a fire going. I packed my bag and decided I'd leave the next morning instead of staying the full week. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a hiker passed through, maybe animals, but something didn't feel right anymore. I didn't want to be there another night. That last day, I didn't go far. I stayed near the cabin, kept an eye on the tree line. I didn't see anyone, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. I found a small trail I hadn't noticed before. Very narrow, more like a path pressed into the grass than a real trail. I followed it about 50 yards before I saw something that froze me in place. There was a tree stump with deep knife marks all over it, like someone had been using it for target practice or carving. The ground around it was trampled. A couple cigarette butts were nearby. It wasn't old. Someone had been here, and recently. I walked back to the cabin fast, kept checking over my shoulder the whole way. That night, I kept my flashlight and knife right next to me. I blocked the door again and didn't build a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I lay in the bed, fully clothed, listening. Around midnight, I heard a crunch outside. Not an animal. A step, then another, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I sat up slowly and clicked on the flashlight, aiming it at the window. Nothing. I waited like that for almost an hour. Eventually, I heard the crunch again, farther away this time, fading. I stayed up the rest of the night. I didn't even try to sleep. At first light, I threw everything into my bag, grabbed my keys, and left. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't even look back. When I reached the dirt road, I walked faster. The drive back felt longer, like every turn was watching me. I didn't calm down until I hit paved roads again. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not for a while. There wasn't really anything to report. No crime, no faces, no proof. Just things that didn't feel right. But it shook me. It made me realize how fragile that feeling of safety is when you're alone, far from help. A week after I got back, I checked the rental site. The listing for the cabin was gone. I don't know if it was taken down because of what happened or something else entirely. I never reached out to the owner. I didn't want to talk about it. I haven't gone camping since. I still like the idea of being in nature, alone with nothing but the trees, but I know now that you're never really alone out there. Someone else might be walking those woods. Someone who doesn't want to be seen. Someone who watches from just beyond the trees, quiet and still, waiting until you stop paying attention. And when they decide to come closer, there's nothing between you but a thin wooden wall and a locked door that might not matter. I didn't get hurt, Nothing was taken, but I left that cabin feeling like I was one small step away from something that could have gone very wrong. I don't think I'll ever go back to a place like that again. Not because I'm scared of the woods, but because I'm scared of I was 33 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was living in Indianapolis at the time, working long hours in commercial real estate. It wasn't a bad job, but the stress piled up more than I realized. I hadn't taken a real vacation in over 3 years, so when I found myself waking up with chest tightness and constantly grinding my teeth, I figured I needed to get away, not to a beach or some hotel. I wanted isolation, silence, somewhere I could just be alone without thinking about emails or meetings or deadlines. I found the cabin online, a small place in northern Minnesota, close to the Canadian border, not far from a town called Ely. It wasn't part of any big rental chain. It was listed on a quiet back-end site by an older guy who lived downstate. The listing said the cabin was originally built in the 70s but had been updated in the early 2000s. No Wi-Fi, no TV, no neighbors for at least a mile in either direction. It looked perfect. I booked it for 10 days in early October 2023. The pictures showed tall pine trees surrounding the place, a gravel driveway, and a small dock leading to a lake called Birch Hollow Lake. The guy who owned it left detailed instructions about how to get there since GPS got spotty past a certain point. I printed everything out just in case. The drive up was long. I left at 5 a.m. and got to the cabin around 4 in the afternoon. It had rained earlier in the day, and the gravel road that led to the place was soft, almost muddy. I had to drive carefully not to slide off into a ditch. When I pulled up, the cabin was just like the photos. A small, single-story structure made of dark brown logs with a green metal roof. The lake was visible through the trees just behind it, calm and wide, reflecting the gray sky. Inside, it was simple but comfortable. A small kitchen with an old stove and mini fridge, a living room with a wood-burning stove, a couch, and a couple of chairs. The bedroom had a full-size bed and a dresser. The bathroom had a composting toilet and a small shower stall. There were extra blankets in the closet and a box of firewood by the stove. The owner had left a handwritten note in a Ziploc bag on the kitchen table with basic rules. One of them stood out. If you go hiking, stick to the trail that runs north by the lake. The old south path past the shed is overgrown and unsafe. I unpacked, got a fire going, made a quick meal with the groceries I brought, and went to bed early. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. No cars, no voices, just the sound of wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I wasn't used to that kind of silence, but it felt good in a strange way. I slept hard. The next few days followed a simple routine. I'd wake up around 7, make coffee, sit by the lake, and just stare at the water. Sometimes I'd read, other times I'd just walk around. I found the trail the owner mentioned, the one running north by the lake. It was narrow but clear, probably used more by deer than people. I'd hike for an hour or two, then head back and eat lunch. I avoided the south trail like he said. I saw it once, past a small wooden shed with a rusted-out door hanging half off. The path beyond it was covered in dead branches and brambles. I didn't even think about trying it. By the 4th day, I felt relaxed for the first time in years. I didn't check my phone. I didn't worry about work. The air was cold and fresh, and the trees were full of color, red, orange, yellow, like something out of a painting. But on the 5th night, something changed. I was inside reading by the stove when I heard a sound outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something moving through the underbrush. But then it repeated, a kind of slow crunching. Footsteps, not animal steps. I turned off the lamp and moved to the window. I couldn't see anything. The moon was half full, but high clouds blocked most of the light. I stared for a while, listening. The sound stopped. I figured maybe it was just a deer walking close by. I went to bed. The next morning, I found prints by the back of the cabin. Not animal prints, boot prints. They weren't mine. I wore trail shoes the whole time. These were heavier, deeper, like work boots. They came in from the trees to the back wall of the cabin and then stopped. No return trail, no walking around the sides, just in, then nothing. That set me on edge. I spent the day inside, listening for sounds, checking the woods every hour. I didn't see anyone, but I had the feeling I was being watched. That kind of tight feeling in the chest you get when something isn't right. Around mid-afternoon, I thought about leaving, but I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe a local hunter had wandered too close and turned around. Still, I started locking the cabin door every time I went out to chop wood or use the outhouse. I also started sleeping with a flashlight and a knife by the bed. On the 6th night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. Around midnight, I heard the sound again, this time slower, like someone trying not to make noise. I got up and went to the window again. I saw nothing, but I didn't go back to bed. I sat up the whole night with my back to the wall, knife in hand, waiting. Nothing else happened until morning. But when I stepped outside, there were more prints. A different set, smaller, coming from the south side, past the shed. They stopped a few feet from the cabin, right near the bedroom window, and then turned back toward the woods. That did it for me. I decided I'd leave that day. I packed up most of my stuff, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from the trees. Every time I looked up, I felt like I was just a few seconds too late to see something duck out of view. I sat in the cabin, trying to calm myself before the long drive. But I kept thinking about the prints. Why come all the way out here just to stop and turn back? It didn't make sense. Around noon, I walked toward the shed, just to check things out. The door was half hanging open, the wood inside rotten. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. But when I peeked inside, I saw fresh footprints in the dust. I didn't go in. I backed away and went straight to the car. The engine wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing, just a clicking sound. Battery was fine. Fuel was full. I checked the hood. Everything looked normal. I'm not a mechanic, but it didn't look tampered with. Still, it wouldn't turn over. I went back inside to figure out what to do. My phone didn't have signal and the radio was dead. I couldn't call for help. The nearest town was 15 miles down the gravel road, and walking it would mean crossing deep woods with whatever was out there still lurking around. I stayed inside that night, lights off, fire out, just listening. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I made a plan to walk to the road and flag down a car. I packed water, energy bars, a knife, a flashlight, and left just after sunrise. I didn't make it far. About a mile down the road, I found a dead deer. It had been dragged onto the path, belly slit open, guts spread wide. But it wasn't the deer that stopped me. It was what was beside it. One of my socks. I'd packed everything, but one pair had gone missing the day before. I figured I'd dropped it, but now here it was, soaked in blood, lying next to the torn open deer. That was a message. I turned around and ran back to the cabin, locked myself inside, and didn't leave. I spent the rest of the day watching the woods, knife in hand. I didn't eat. I barely drank anything. I kept expecting someone to come through the trees, but no one did. That night, just after dark, I heard the crunching again. This time it didn't stop. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other. Slow, steady steps, like someone circling. I heard a soft tap on the window, then another on the far wall. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then everything went quiet. An hour passed. 2. Then the sound of the shed door creaking open. It echoed faintly, but I knew exactly what it was. I stayed frozen until sunrise. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside. Everything looked normal. The woods were still. The prints from the night had already started to fade in the morning dew. I walked to the shed again, heart pounding. Inside, something had changed. There was a piece of rope, freshly cut, hanging from one of the rafters, and another sock of mine, tied into a knot and hung from a nail, like some kind of twisted warning. I was done. I left everything but the essentials and started walking south toward the highway. I carried the knife the whole way. I didn't stop. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I walked until my legs hurt so badly I thought they might give out. 9 hours later, just as the sun was setting, I reached the edge of a small roadside gas station on Route 1. I went inside, asked to use the phone, and called the local sheriff. They sent a deputy to check the cabin with me the next morning. When we got there, the car started up just fine. No sign of damage. The shed door was closed. No rope, no sock, no footprints. Everything was cleaned up, like nothing had ever happened. I could tell the